Nathan Caldwell tore the letter in half before he finished reading it. His hands were shaking. Not from grief, not from anger. From something worse, the slow, creeping realization that he had just agreed to bring a woman into a home he had spent 6 years making sure no one could survive in. He pressed both palms flat against the desk and stared at the torn paper. What in God's name have I done? If you've ever felt like you were too broken to deserve something good, stay with me until the very end of this story. And if you're watching right now, drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe to this channel and hit that bell because what happens next between Nathan Caldwell and Margaret Ellis is going to change the way you think about second chances forever. Nathan Caldwell hadn't spoken a woman's name out loud in 6 years. Not since the morning he stood at the foot of a freshly turned grave on the eastern edge of his property and told himself quietly, deliberately, the way a man seals a wound, that he was finished with all of it. Finished with hoping. Finished with needing. Finished with the particular kind of pain that only comes from loving someone and watching them disappear anyway. Clara had been her name. And he didn't say it. Not once. Not to his ranch hands. Not to his neighbors. Not to the preacher who came out twice that first winter offering comfort. Nathan neither wanted nor believed he deserved. He just worked. That was what men like Nathan did. They got up before the sun, and they didn't stop until the dark forced them inside. They fixed fences and moved cattle and checked water lines and kept their eyes on the land because the land didn't leave. The land didn't get sick in the night. The land didn't make a sound when it was suffering. And that suited Nathan just fine because neither did he. His ranch sat 14 miles outside of Ridgeback, Colorado, far enough from town that a man could convince himself he preferred the quiet. He had 3 hands working for him, a stocky Mexican named Ernesto, who'd been with him since the beginning, a young kid named Pete, who had more enthusiasm than sense, and an older man called Hatch, who barely spoke and therefore got along with Nathan better than most people had in years. The operation was functional. The cattle were healthy. The fences held. But the house was something else. It wasn't dirty. Nathan wasn't a man who let things go to filth. But there was a particular kind of emptiness that had nothing to do with cleanliness, the kind you feel when you walk into a room and realize that nothing in it has moved in 6 years. That every object is exactly where it was placed by someone who is no longer there. That the curtains are still the ones she hung. That the coffee tin is still on the left side of the shelf, not the right, because that's where she kept it, and he never once thought to move it. It was the loneliest kind of clean. And Nathan had been living in it so long, he'd stopped noticing. He was 38 years old the spring he finally admitted to himself that something had to change. It wasn't a dramatic realization. It wasn't grief breaking open again, or some sudden clarity that arrived with the sunrise. It was more like exhaustion. The slow grinding kind. He'd come in from 3 days of rough weather on the north pasture, cold to the bone mud on his boots, and he'd stood in the doorway of that silent kitchen and looked at the cold stove and the empty table and the single tin cup sitting alone on the shelf, and he thought, I cannot do this for another 20 years. Not because he was unhappy exactly. Nathan wasn't a man who thought much about happiness. It was more that he was tired of doing absolutely everything alone. The cooking, the record-keeping, the mending, the endless small details of keeping a household functioning while also keeping 700 acres of Colorado ranch land from falling apart. He needed help. Practical, functional, dependable help. He was careful to frame it exactly that way in his own mind. Help, not company, not warmth, not anything that came anywhere close to what he and Clara had shared before the sickness took her. He wasn't looking for any of that. He was quite certain in the way a man is certain when he has spent years building a wall and reinforcing it against every storm, that he was not capable of any of that anymore. He wrote to a marriage agency in Kansas City. His letter was 3 sentences long. I am a rancher in Colorado Territory. I require a capable wife who can manage a household and assist with basic record keeping. I am not a man of sentiment. Practical arrangements are preferred. He almost didn't send it. He stood at the edge of town with the sealed envelope in his hand for a full 10 minutes, while Hatch waited on the wagon without asking a single question, which was one of the many reasons Nathan valued the man's company. Then he walked into the post office, handed it over, and didn't think about it again for 3 weeks. When the agency's reply came, he read it standing at the kitchen table, and then set it face down beside the coffee tin and went back outside to work. They had a woman. Her name was Margaret Ellis. She was 30 years old. She was from a town called Harlow, Missouri. She was the daughter of a merchant, educated, capable with numbers and household management. Widowed once briefly before her husband passed from fever. No children. They included a photograph. Nathan didn't look at it until evening. He picked it up, held it toward the lantern light, and studied it for exactly 30 seconds. Margaret Ellis was not a small woman. That was the first thing a person noticed, not because she was anything less than what she was, but because the photograph didn't hide it, and Nathan suspected she hadn't asked it to. She sat straight-backed in the image, with her hands folded in her lap and her chin level, and her eyes looking directly at the camera with an expression that was harder to read than he expected. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't performing sweetness or softness, or any of the things he figured a woman answering a marriage advertisement might feel pressured to perform. She just looked present, steady, like a woman who had made her peace with being seen and was waiting to find out what you were going to do about it. Nathan put the photograph down. "All right," he said to no one. He wrote back to the agency the next morning. He confirmed the arrangement. He sent a train ticket and instructions for the stagecoach connection from Ridgeback. He wrote one additional line at the bottom of the letter that he rewrote 4 times before settling on the wording. "Miss Ellis should understand that I am offering a home and a legal arrangement. I am not in a position to offer more than that." He folded it, sealed it, sent it before he could think about it longer than necessary. What he did not expect, what he had genuinely failed to account for in all of his careful, practical, unsentimental planning, was that Margaret Ellis had read that final line and she had written back. Her reply arrived 10 days later. Nathan read it standing in the kitchen. Then he sat down. Then he read it again. She had written, "Mr. Caldwell, I have received your letter and I appreciate your honesty. I have no interest in pretending we are something we are not. I am also not coming west under any illusions about romance or affection. I need a home. You need help. I understand practical arrangements. I will be there on the 15th. One thing only, I cook. Whatever else I do or do not do on your ranch, I cook. That is non-negotiable." Nathan stared at that last part for a long time. Then, for the first time in approximately 3 years, the left corner of his mouth did something that almost resembled a smile. He put her letter in the desk drawer. He did not look at it again, but he didn't throw it away either. The morning of the 15th arrived hot and bright the way Colorado summer mornings can be, when the mountains haven't decided yet whether they're going to send clouds. Nathan drove the wagon into Ridgeback alone. He'd told Ernesto he didn't need company. Ernesto had looked at him with the particular expression of a man who knows better than to say what he's thinking and let him go. The stagecoach was 17 minutes late. Nathan stood beside the wagon with his hat in his hands and told himself this was no different from any other errand. He was picking up a woman who was going to help him run the ranch. That was all this was. When the coach finally rolled in trailing dust and noise, and the particular chaos of passengers unloading after a long journey, Nathan watched the door and waited. 3 men got off first, then a woman with a child, and then Margaret Ellis stepped down onto the dirt of Ridgeback, Colorado, and Nathan stopped thinking clearly for a moment. It wasn't that she was what he expected. She was what the photograph showed, a tall, full-figured woman with dark brown hair pinned back under a practical hat, wearing a simple blue dress that had clearly been on a coach for many hours and bore the evidence honestly. She carried one worn leather suitcase. She looked around with a steady, assessing gaze that moved across the street and the buildings and the people with the calm focus of a woman cataloging information rather than seeking approval. Then her eyes found him. Nathan had thought about what he'd say. He'd spent 14 miles of wagon road deciding on something appropriate. Professional. Sensible. The kind of greeting that would set the right tone for the practical arrangement they'd agreed upon. What he said was, "Miss Ellis." "Mr. Caldwell?" She walked directly to him without hesitation, no fluttering, no nervousness, no performance of anything. She extended her hand and he shook it. Her grip was firm. "The road from Denver is rough this time of year." "It is," he said. "Is the ranch far?" 14 miles. "Then we should go." That was it. Nathan took her suitcase. She let him without protest or excessive gratitude, just a simple nod, and he put it in the wagon, and they climbed up and turned back toward the ranch, and the whole thing had taken less than 4 minutes. They drove in silence for a while. Nathan kept his eyes on the road. Margaret kept her eyes on everything else, the land, the way the grass moved, the shape of the mountains to the west, the quality of the fence lines when they passed them. She didn't fill the silence with words. He noticed that. He noticed it the way a man notices something unexpected and files it away because he's not sure yet what it means. After about 20 minutes, she said, "Your north fences need work." Nathan looked at her. "You can tell that from the road. The posts lean." She kept her eyes on the land. 3 of them in that last quarter mile. If the cattle test them before winter, you'll have a problem." Nathan looked back at the road. "They've been on my list," he said. "Good." Another stretch of quiet. Then she said, "You were married before." It wasn't a question. He didn't know how she knew. Maybe the agency had told her, maybe something in his letters, but her voice was even when she said it, matter of fact, no pity packed into the words. Just a statement placed there between them, the way you'd set down a tool you planned to pick up again later. "Yes," he said. "I was too," she said. Briefly. "It was a long time ago." He waited to see if she'd say more. She didn't. "I should tell you," Nathan said after a moment, and he kept his voice flat and his eyes on the road, because that was how he said true things, that I meant what I wrote. I'm not. He stopped, started again. "I'm not capable of the same kind of, Mr. Caldwell." Her voice was quiet but very clear. "I didn't come here for that. I came here because I needed somewhere to go, and you needed someone to help. That's enough to start with. You don't owe me an explanation about what you are or aren't capable of." He looked at her then, just for a second. She was already looking back at the mountains. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. The wagon moved on through the afternoon heat, and Nathan Caldwell felt something strange and unwelcome shift somewhere in his chest. Not warmth, not quite, nothing as simple as that, but something like the moment when a door that has been stuck for years gives just slightly, just enough to feel the air on the other side. He chose not to think about it. He was very good at choosing not to think about things. But the door had moved, and somewhere in the part of himself he'd spent 6 years walling off, Nathan Caldwell knew without allowing himself to say it out loud, without letting it become a thought he could hold up and examine, that something had just changed. He just didn't know yet how completely. When they pulled up to the ranch, Ernesto came out of the barn and stopped short when he saw Margaret. Not in a rude way, Ernesto was a good man, but in the involuntary way of someone encountering something they hadn't quite prepared for. Nathan watched from the corner of his eye. Margaret looked at Ernesto with that same steady, unhurried assessment. "You must be one of the hands," she said. "Ernesto, ma'am." He pulled his hat off, fast, surprised into courtesy. "Welcome to the Caldwell Ranch." "Thank you, Ernesto." She looked around the yard with that cataloging gaze again. Then she looked at Nathan. "I'd like to see the kitchen before anything else." "It's through the front." She nodded and walked toward the house without waiting to be led. Nathan watched her go. Ernesto came to stand beside him. After a moment, he said very quietly, in the tone of a man choosing his words with extreme care, "She's not what I pictured." "No," Nathan agreed. "Is that good or bad?" Nathan reached into the wagon for the suitcase. "I don't know yet," he said. But inside the house, Margaret Ellis was already standing in the kitchen, with her hands on her hips, and her eyes moving from the cold stove to the bare shelves to the single tin cup. And she was already thinking clearly, quietly, without sentimentality, about what this place needed and what she was going to do about it. She'd been in places that didn't want her before. She knew how to work in spaces that hadn't made room for her yet. She knew how to be useful in ways that couldn't be ignored. And she knew, with the same bone-deep certainty she'd brought with her all the way from Harlow, Missouri, that Nathan Caldwell's cold, careful, deliberate distance was not the problem he thought it was. It was a wound, and she'd spent enough time around wounded things to know that the worst thing you could do was force them. You just had to be steady, and she was very, very good at steady. What she was not prepared for, what no amount of practical thinking had accounted for, was the degree to which that steadiness would be tested. Because Nathan Caldwell's ranch had secrets, the kind that didn't stay buried. And somewhere in the mountains to the west, a man was already watching that land, with calculating eyes and plans he hadn't yet put into motion. Margaret Ellis had come to Colorado looking for a home. She was about to discover that she'd walked into a war. Pete was the first one to say anything to her face that had real bite to it. He was 19, maybe 20, with the particular brand of confidence that young men develop when they've never been made to account for it. He came into the kitchen the second morning while Margaret was at the stove and stopped in the doorway and looked at her the way boys look at things they've already decided aren't worth respecting. "You're the mail-order wife," he said. Margaret didn't turn around. "You're the young one, Pete. How'd you know that?" "Because Ernesto's got manners, and the older one doesn't talk enough to say something like that." There was a beat of silence. "No offense meant," Pete said, though his voice suggested otherwise. "Yes, you did." She turned now, holding a pan, her voice still even. "You meant some. But I'm not easily offended, so you've wasted the effort. You want breakfast or not?" He stared at her. Then he sat down. It was not a conquest. Margaret wasn't interested in conquests. But it was a line drawn, and Pete felt it, and for the rest of that week, he was at minimum civil, which was more than he'd apparently been prepared to offer at the outset. Nathan came in that morning after Pete had gone back out and sat at the table in his usual silence, and Margaret set a plate in front of him without ceremony. He looked at it. Eggs, biscuits, something with the dried meat from the cold cellar, turned into something that smelled considerably better than it had before she got to it. He looked up at her. "You heard that," he said. "I hear everything," she said, sitting down across from him with her own plate. "It's fine." "It's not fine. He shouldn't have been Nathan." She said his name directly and without softness, but without hardness either. "I have been handling boys like that since I was 16 years old. I don't need you to correct him on my behalf. If I need something handled, I'll tell you." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his expression that she couldn't quite read yet. There would be weeks of learning to read him. She already knew layers and defenses and carefully maintained blanks where his feelings were supposed to go. "All right," he said. "Good." She picked up her fork. "Your biscuits were stale, by the way. I found a sack of flour behind the other sack. It had weevils. Lord. I got rid of it. I've added flour to the list of what we need from town." Nathan looked at his biscuit. "These don't taste stale." "No, they aren't. I used the good flour." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Thank you." It was a small word simply said. Margaret didn't make anything of it, but she noticed the fact that he said it at all, and she filed it away in the same careful place she filed everything she was learning about Nathan Caldwell. He thanked her. That meant something. She just didn't know yet exactly what. The first time she saw him grieve was an accident. She'd been on the ranch 11 days. She'd been careful, deliberate, taking up space slowly, the way you do when you're moving into someone else's pain. She'd fixed the kitchen and organized the cellar and started the garden beds on the south side of the house, where the soil looked like it might still hold something good. She'd taken over the record books Nathan showed her. His handwriting was precise, and his numbers were accurate, but his system was inefficient, and she'd begun reorganizing it in a way that would make the fall accounting considerably less painful. She had not gone into the room at the end of the short hallway. It was clearly a room Nathan didn't use. The door was always closed. She knew without asking that it was the room where Clara had been. She knew the way you know things about a man who has never explained himself through the shape of what he avoids. On the 11th night, she was up before dawn. She couldn't sleep. It wasn't unusual for her. She'd always been an early riser, her mind running ahead of her body before the sun had anything to say about it. She came quietly out of her room and went to the kitchen to start the stove. She was standing with her back to the hallway when she heard it. Very quiet. From behind the closed door. She stood still for a long moment, her hand on the kettle, not moving. She had never heard Nathan Caldwell cry. She suspected he would have said he didn't, if asked. That he was not a man who did that, had not been one since the war, since the early hard years, since Clara. Whichever point he had decided that grief was a private accounting done in the dark, where it couldn't cost him anything in daylight. She didn't move toward the door. She didn't say anything. She just stood there in the kitchen and let him have it, the way you let a storm have the sky, not because you can do anything about it, but because some things require space to happen without interference. She made coffee. When she heard the door open, she was already at the table, with 2 cups poured. Nathan came into the kitchen. His face was closed. He'd put everything back in its place. His eyes were dry. He looked at her sitting calmly at the table with the 2 cups, and she looked back at him without pity and without the particular expression of a woman pretending she didn't notice anything, which would have been worse. He sat down. He picked up the cup. He said nothing. She said nothing. After a long moment he said, "She would have liked the garden." Margaret considered that. "What did she plant?" she asked. "Marigolds." A pause. She liked the way they smelled. "I'll plant marigolds on the south side," Margaret said. "There's room between the beans." Nathan looked at his coffee cup. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "I want to." He didn't say anything else for a while. Neither did she. They sat in the early morning dark and drank their coffee in a silence that had changed quietly and without ceremony into something that was no longer empty. It was the first morning she felt like she might actually belong here. She didn't let herself feel it too fully. She had learned a long time ago not to do that, not to let the belonging in all the way before you knew whether it was going to hold. She'd made that mistake before, in Harlow, before she came west. She'd let herself believe a place was hers and then found out very clearly and very publicly that it was not. But this was something. The marigolds were hers, the coffee was hers, the morning was hers. And for now, that was enough. Nathan went outside when the sun came up the way he always did, and Margaret went back to the record books the way she always did, and the ranch moved forward the way it always had. Except that something was different, something small and irreversible. And neither of them said a word about it. It was in the 3rd week that she found the letter. She hadn't been snooping. That wasn't in her character, and it wasn't in her interest. She'd been going through the desk in the main room because Nathan had given her access to all the financial records, and the deed paperwork was something she needed to locate for the record reorganization she was doing. The envelope was not hidden exactly. It was at the back of the bottom drawer under a land survey map, and she would not have seen it if the map hadn't slid when she pulled the drawer too fast. It was small, cream-colored. The ink on the front was faded. Her name wasn't on it. There was no name on it. But she recognized the handwriting on the back flap because she'd seen Nathan's writing in the record books every day for 3 weeks, and this handwriting was different. Softer. A woman's hand. Margaret looked at it for a long moment. She put it back under the map. She found the deed she needed. She closed the drawer. But she thought about it all day while she worked through the ledgers, and she thought about it in the evening while she was putting supper together, and she was still thinking about it when Nathan came in at dusk and sat down at the table, looking like a man who had run himself through his full capacity and still found more work waiting on the other side. She put a plate in front of him. She sat down across from him, and she said, not looking up from her own food, "There's a letter in the bottom drawer of the desk, under the survey map. I found it by accident when I was looking for the deed. I didn't read it." Nathan went very still. Then he put his fork down. He looked at her. She met his eyes. "It's been in there 6 years," he said. "I know," she said. "I put it back." He was quiet. Outside, the sound of the evening wind through the grass. "It's from Clara," he said finally. "She wrote it when she knew she was sick, before the end. She gave it to the pastor to give to me." He stopped. "I've never been able to read it." Margaret held his gaze. "You don't have to," she said. "Maybe you never do. That's your business." "But you think I should." "I think," she said carefully, "that you're still living in that letter, whether you read it or not. I think you've been waiting 6 years for something to stop hurting without knowing that the hurting won't stop until you decide to let whatever's in it be finished." His jaw tightened. She saw it. "You've only known me 3 weeks," he said. His voice was quiet, but there was an edge there. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry. It's not my place." She looked back at her food. The silence stretched. Then Nathan said slowly and quietly, "She would have known what to say about you." Margaret looked up. "Clara," he said. "She always knew what to say about people. She could read them fast." A long pause. "She would have said something that made me feel foolish for not seeing it myself." Margaret didn't speak. "She would have liked you," Nathan said. The words were plain direct with no ornamentation. "I think she would have been glad." Margaret had been composed every single day since she arrived. She'd been steady and useful and sensible, and she'd kept every feeling she had in its proper place, because that was what the situation required, and because she understood the terms she'd come here under, and because she was not a woman who let herself want things she hadn't been given reason to want. But something in those words, "she would have been glad," went straight through all of that. She didn't cry. She didn't let herself do that. But she pressed her lips together very briefly and looked at her coffee cup, and when she looked back up, she said simply, "Thank you." Nathan nodded once. They finished supper in silence. But it was the third kind of silence she'd cataloged in 3 weeks on this ranch, and this one was different from the others. This one wasn't empty. It wasn't guarded. It was the silence of two people who had both, without meaning to, without planning for it, without allowing themselves to name it for what it was, let the other one in, just a little, just a crack, just enough. The marigold seeds arrived from town at the end of the 3rd week, and Margaret planted them on a cool morning, while the mountains to the west still had mist at their peaks. She was on her knees in the south bed when she heard Nathan come up behind her and stop. She didn't turn around. She kept pressing seeds into the soil one by one, spacing them the way she knew they liked to grow. After a moment, he crouched down beside her, not touching, just near. "You're spacing them wrong," he said. She looked at him sideways. Clara spaced them closer. They grew better. "Is that right?" 6 inches, he said, not 8. Margaret looked at the row she'd been making and considered telling him that 8 inches was the agronomically correct spacing for marigolds in mountain climate zones. She had read this. She was sure of it. Instead, she moved to the next seed and pressed it 6 inches from the last. "Like that," she said. Nathan looked at the spacing. "Like that," he said. He stayed there for a few minutes, crouched beside her in the dirt, and he didn't help with the planting, and she didn't ask him to, and eventually he stood and went back to whatever he'd been doing. But he'd come over. He'd stayed, and he'd told her how Clara had planted them. Margaret pressed the next seed into the ground at exactly 6 inches and felt that small, careful warmth she'd been keeping carefully banked begin despite every effort to glow just slightly brighter. She was in trouble. She knew it. She'd come here with clear eyes and reasonable expectations, and the very sensible, very self-protective understanding that Nathan Caldwell had told her plainly what he could and couldn't offer. And she had agreed to those terms, and she had meant to keep those terms, and she was now sitting in the dirt of his garden, planting his dead wife's flowers at the spacing his dead wife had preferred, and she was in absolutely no danger of keeping those terms. But there was something else stirring in the territory around this ranch. Something that had nothing to do with marigolds or old letters, or the slow thaw of a man who had spent 6 years making sure no one could reach him. 3 days earlier, a rider had come up the main road and stopped at the edge of the property. Nathan had been in the north pasture. Margaret had been at the house. The man had not come to the door. He'd sat on his horse at the edge of the road for a long time, looking at the land, looking at the house. Then he'd turned around and gone back the way he came. Ernesto had seen him. He'd come to Margaret in the kitchen that evening, hat in hand, with a look on his face she'd never seen from him before. "That man," he said carefully, "his name is Whitmore. He's been buying up land east of here, 3 ranches in the last year." "Buying," Margaret said. Ernesto looked at his hat. "Some of them didn't want to sell, but they did." "They did," he said quietly. Margaret had looked out the kitchen window at the road where the man had sat on his horse. "Does Nathan know? I'll tell him tonight." "Tell him now," she said. Ernesto went. Nathan had come into the kitchen that evening with a look she was beginning to recognize, the particular flatness that meant he was thinking something he wasn't ready to say yet, organizing information into order before he let any of it out. He'd told her about Whitmore. He'd told her more than she expected him to share, actually, which she noticed, about the land to the east, about the families that had sold, about a rumor from the land office in Denver that someone was putting together large parcels for a railway deal. "They can't force you to sell," Margaret said. "No," Nathan agreed. "But they can make it hard to hold on." He looked at her. "You've seen this before. My father was a merchant. I've seen what happens when someone powerful decides they want something a smaller man has. They don't come at you straight." She paused. "Do you have all your papers in order?" "The deed, the water rights, the original survey." Nathan's expression shifted. Something sharpened there. "The water rights document is at the land office in Denver. I've been meaning to get a copy brought here." "Do that," she said immediately. "This week if you can. And I want to go through everything in the desk, all of it, and make sure we know exactly what we have and exactly what we can prove." Nathan looked at her for a long moment. "We," he said. She met his eyes. "Unless you'd prefer I stay out of it." He was quiet. "No," he said finally. "No. You're right to look at it." A pause. "I'd appreciate the help." She nodded and went back to the stove. But she was thinking hard now, faster and more intently than she'd thought about anything since arriving, because she recognized the situation with the particular clarity of a woman who had watched her father's store get systematically undercut and surrounded and starved until he sold for less than it was worth to a man who smiled the whole time he did it. She was not going to let that happen here. This was her home now, or it was becoming one. And Margaret Ellis had not come 1,400 miles to let someone take it from her before she'd properly gotten her hands around it. Outside, the Colorado evening was settling into something cool and vast and silent, the way evenings do, out in that country where the sky goes on forever and the mountains stand at the edges of everything like they're keeping watch. Margaret stood at the kitchen window and looked west, where the last of the sun was painting the peaks gold. She thought about Whitmore on his horse at the edge of the road. She thought about the water rights in Denver. She thought about Nathan's face when he said "we." She pressed her palm flat against the cool glass of the window. This was her home, and she was just getting started. The water rights document arrived from Denver on a Tuesday, and Margaret had it open on the kitchen table before Nathan finished unhitching the horse. She'd been waiting for it 4 days. She hadn't said so. She'd gone about her work, the cooking and the ledgers and the garden. She'd done all of it without appearing to wait. But Nathan had noticed the way her eyes went to the road every morning just once before she turned back to whatever she was doing. He'd noticed, and he hadn't said anything because he was learning that Margaret Ellis didn't appreciate having her private workings pointed out. She preferred to think she was unreadable. He was starting to find that she wasn't. "Sit down," she said when he came through the door. He sat. She spread the document flat and put her finger on a line near the bottom of the second page. "Read that." Nathan leaned in. He read it. Then he read it again. "That's not right," he said. "No," she said. "It's not." The water rights on the document from Denver showed a boundary line that didn't match the boundary Nathan had been working from for 12 years. The line on this paper put the primary creek tributary, the water source that fed his entire south pasture, outside his legal claim. 300 feet outside. Nathan sat back slowly. "That's not what the original deed says," he said. "I know. I have the original deed right here." She laid it beside the water rights document. "Look at the survey marker reference. Deed says stone marker at the base of the ridge. Water rights document says iron post at the fence line. There's no iron post at that fence line. There wasn't one when you bought this land. No. Then someone put it there after," she said quietly. "Or they never put it there at all and just wrote it down like they did." Nathan looked at both documents for a long moment. A muscle worked in his jaw. Margaret watched him process it, watched the way his face went through controlled anger, and then passed it into something colder and more deliberate, which she'd already learned was actually more dangerous. "Whitmore," he said. "It would explain why he's been sitting at the edge of your road looking at the south pasture," she said. "If that water claim doesn't belong to you on paper, your south pasture dries up in August every year. Cattle can't run it. Land value drops by half, maybe more. Then he comes to you with an offer. And I'm supposed to be grateful to sell." "That's the plan," she said. Nathan pushed back from the table. He stood. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to her and his hands at his sides, and Margaret gave him the space to be furious without having to manage how it looked. After a minute, he said, "How do we prove the iron post doesn't belong in the original survey?" "We find the original surveyor's field notes," she said. "Every survey generates field notes, the raw measurements, the reference points, the notes the surveyor writes as he goes. The filed document at the land office is a summary. The field notes are the original record. If the iron post is nowhere in the field notes, then it was added to the filed document afterward. That's fraud." Nathan turned around. He looked at her across the kitchen. "Where are the field notes?" "Denver, the territorial surveyor's office. But I know someone who might be able to tell us exactly where and how to request them without tipping off anyone at the county land office." She paused. "My father did business with a surveyor out of Kansas City for 15 years. He had a cousin in the Colorado territorial office. I wrote to my father's old partner last week." Nathan stared at her. "You wrote to him last week," he said slowly. "Before the document arrived. I wrote to him the same day Ernesto told me about Whitmore." Another silence. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't know yet if there was anything to tell," she said simply. "I didn't want to alarm you over a suspicion. Now there's something to tell." He kept looking at her with that expression she was still learning, the one that was partly assessment, partly something else she didn't let herself name yet. "Margaret," he said. "Nathan. How did your father's store end up?" Her chin came up slightly. "He sold it for 60 cents on the dollar to the man who'd been trying to buy it for 3 years. He was 61 years old, and he was tired, and they had worn him down in ways he didn't know how to fight." A beat. "I was 22, she said. "I watched it happen, and I didn't know enough yet to stop it." Nathan held her gaze. "You know enough now," he said. It wasn't a question. She didn't answer it like one. "Yes," she said. "I do." He pulled his chair back out and sat down. "Show me everything you've found so far, all of it." She showed him. They sat at that kitchen table until well past midnight, the lantern burning low between them, and Margaret walked Nathan through every discrepancy she'd found in the documents, every number that didn't line up, every reference point that contradicted another. She'd been building the case in her head for weeks, quietly, methodically, the way her father had taught her to go through accounts, and now she laid it all out in order, and Nathan followed it without interruption, asking sharp questions when he needed clarification and staying silent when he didn't. By the time they pushed back from the table, the discrepancies weren't just a suspicion anymore. They were a pattern, and patterns told stories. "There's a man in Ridgeback," Nathan said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Lawyer named Aldous Crane. I've used him twice for property matters. He's honest. Can you trust him to keep this quiet? As much as I can trust anyone in town. A pause. Which I'll admit isn't saying much at the moment. We need to be careful who knows what we've found and when, she said. If Whitmore has people in the county land office, and I think he does, or the document alteration would be harder to manage, then word travels faster than we'd want. Nathan nodded slowly. I'll ride to see Crane tomorrow, early before I go to the pasture. I'll go alone. Good, she said. Don't bring the documents, not yet. Just talk to him. See what he knows about Whitmore and the land acquisitions east of here. You think Crane might already know something. I think in a county this size, a man who pays attention knows most things. She stood and gathered the papers into careful order. Let me make copies of the key sections before you go. If anything happens to these originals, nothing's going to happen to them. She looked at him steadily. Nathan, make me the copies anyway. He looked at her for a moment. All right, he said. She was up before dawn, making copies in her careful, precise hand, the same hand her father had taught her on his account books, every number clear, every reference exact. The first thin light was coming through the kitchen window when Nathan came in dressed for town, and she handed him a folded sheet with the key discrepancies written out in plain language, nothing that would give away how much they knew if someone else saw it, just enough for a lawyer to understand the question being asked. He took it. Looked at it. You wrote this so it looks like a general inquiry, he said. In case it ends up in the wrong hands, she said. Which I hope it won't, but... He folded it and put it inside his coat. He picked up his hat. At the door, he turned back. Margaret. She looked up from the stove. You're not what I planned for, he said. It was quiet and direct and had no decoration on it. She held his gaze. Neither are you, she said. He left. She stood at the kitchen window and watched him ride out toward Ridgeback in the early morning gray, and she let herself feel for exactly 30 seconds everything she'd been keeping carefully filed away since the night they sat at this table, and he told her Clara would have liked her. Then she put it back where it belonged and went to start the breakfast for the hands. Nathan came back from Ridgeback in the late afternoon with mud on his boots and a look on his face that told her the conversation with Aldous Crane had not been as straightforward as he'd hoped. He came in, poured himself coffee, sat down. Margaret sat across from him and waited. Crane knows Whitmore, he said. Not personally, but he's seen his name on 3 property transactions in the county in the past 14 months. 2 of them went through without contest. One had a dispute family named Orville. They owned a cattle operation out on the flats. They argued the sale was coerced. Case went to the circuit judge. What happened? Orville lost, Nathan said. Crane said the judge threw out their evidence on a procedural issue. They couldn't get a second hearing. He paused. The judge who ruled is a man named Harlan Foster. Crane was careful about how he said the next part. But he said it. He said Foster has ruled in favor of Whitmore-adjacent interests on 4 separate occasions in the last 2 years. He said a man would be foolish to bring a case about disputed land claims before Foster without iron proof, and without significant public attention on the matter. Margaret was quiet for a moment. He's saying the judge is in Whitmore's pocket. He's saying a man would need to be very careful. That's the same thing said politely. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. Did he look at the note you brought? He did. Nathan set his cup down. He said if what I was describing was accurate, it was a serious matter. He also said proving document alteration in a territorial land office was extremely difficult without the original field notes, and that requesting those field notes would likely not go unnoticed by people who would prefer they not be examined. We need the field notes. I know. We need them before Whitmore knows we're looking. I know that too. His voice was flat. Crane said he could request them through a contact in Denver on a matter unrelated to the specific claim, but it would take time. Weeks, maybe more. We don't have weeks, Margaret said. Nathan looked at her sharply. What do you know that I don't? She got up and went to the shelf where she kept the stack of papers she'd been building. She pulled out a folded letter. "This came yesterday with the post while you were working the north pasture. It's from my father's old business partner, the surveyor's cousin I wrote to." She set it open on the table. Nathan read it. She watched his jaw go tight. The letter said that the Territorial Surveyor's Office had received a formal request to review the water rights boundaries on several properties in the Ridgeback area. The request had come from a land development company registered in Missouri. The review was scheduled for 6 weeks from now. Once a formal review was open, the filed documents became the basis of record. Any subsequent dispute would be measured against them, not against any alternative survey or original field notes. In 6 weeks, if nothing changed, the fraudulent water rights document would be locked in as the official record, and Nathan Caldwell's South Pasture would have no legal water access. Nathan put the letter down. He said nothing for a full minute. Margaret waited. 6 weeks, he finally said. Yes. To get the field notes, prove alteration, file a counterclaim, and either get before a judge who isn't bought or go around the county system entirely to the territorial level. He said it evenly, like a man reading a list of obstacles before deciding which order to hit them in. Yes, she said again. Can it be done? She looked at him directly. I don't know, but I know if we don't try, we lose by default. He put both palms flat on the table, a gesture she recognized by now as him organizing himself for something difficult. All right, he said. What do we do first? It was the first time he'd said we without seeming to notice he was saying it. Margaret noticed. She didn't say anything about it. First, she said, I need to know everything about the original purchase of this land. Every person involved, who surveyed it, who witnessed the deed signing, who filed it at the county office. Names. That was 12 years ago. I know. But someone was there. Someone has a memory and probably a copy of something we don't have yet, Nathan thought. Man named Gideon Pratt witnessed the deed. He was the Ridgeback County recorder at the time. He retired. I think he's still in the area out on the Crestwood Road. Can he be trusted? He's 80 if he's a day, and he has no love for newcomers to the county, Nathan said. Whitmore qualifies as a newcomer, so yes, I think he can be trusted. Then we go see Gideon Pratt. Tomorrow. Tomorrow morning, she said. And Nathan, I'd like to come with you. He looked at her. She held his gaze steadily, not asking for permission exactly, but making clear she was giving him the chance to have a position on it before she simply showed up at the wagon. He picked up his hat from the table. Be ready at 7, he said. She was ready at 6:45. They almost didn't get there. They were 3 miles down the Crestwood Road the next morning. Margaret beside Nathan on the wagon seat in the sharp early air when Nathan suddenly pulled up the horse without warning. Margaret grabbed the side of the seat. What? Rider, he said quietly. Coming fast from the east. Don't turn yet. She didn't turn. She kept her eyes forward while Nathan watched from the corner of his eye. The rider was coming from the direction of the Whitmore properties. He passed them at speed without slowing, never looking their way, which was in itself a peculiar piece of behavior on a road this quiet, where you generally acknowledged people you passed. Nathan watched him go. That man was at the Ridgeback Land Office last month, he said. I saw him coming out when I was posting the letter to the agency. I didn't know then who he worked for. Margaret turned now and looked at the dust the rider left. He wasn't going to Pratt's place, she asked. Wrong direction. He was heading to Ridgeback. Does he know where we're going? He couldn't know, Nathan said, but he didn't sound certain. How many people know you've spoken to Crane? Nathan was quiet. Nathan. Crane wouldn't. I'm not saying Crane told anyone intentionally, she said carefully. I'm asking who might have seen you go in or come out. A longer silence. The office is on Main Street, Nathan said. It's not a subtle location. Margaret looked back at the road ahead of them. Let's go see Gideon Pratt, she said. And let's be quicker about it than we planned. Gideon Pratt lived in a small house that had been added onto so many times over the decades that it looked like several different buildings that had agreed, somewhat reluctantly, to share a roof. He came to the door in response to Nathan's knock, wearing suspenders over his undershirt and holding a coffee cup. And when he saw Nathan, his face went through recognition, then surprise, then a more guarded calculation that made Margaret trust him considerably more than if he'd simply been open and welcoming. Careful men in her experience were more reliable than friendly ones. "Caldwell," he said. "Mr. Pratt." Nathan tipped his hat. "This is my wife, Margaret." Pratt looked at her with sharp pale eyes that had lost none of their assessment capacity to age. "Caldwell got himself a wife," he said, not to anyone in particular. "Come in." They went in. Pratt listened without interruption while Nathan laid out the discrepancy between the deed and the water rights document. He didn't react visibly. He just listened, and when Nathan finished, he turned his pale eyes to Margaret. "You found this," he said. "I was reorganizing the property records," she said. "The discrepancy in the survey marker references was the first thing I noticed. The boundary line difference was the second." "What do you know about survey practice?" "My father worked with a surveyor for many years. I learned bookkeeping in his office. I know how records should look, and I know when a reference point has been changed because the language shifts." She paused. "The language in the water rights document shifts." Pratt was quiet for a moment. Then he set down his coffee cup. "I witnessed Nathan's deed signing," he said, 12 years ago. I also filed the original water rights registration. I wrote the description myself." He looked at Nathan. "The iron post reference is not in anything I wrote. I have never in 40 years of county record work used iron post references for rural water rights in this territory. Stone markers and natural features. That's the standard." Nathan leaned forward. "Can you testify to that?" Pratt looked at him steadily. "Before Judge Foster." The name landed in the room the way a stone lands in still water. Nathan's jaw tightened. "If it came to that." "It won't come to that," Pratt said flatly. "Foster will find a way to exclude my testimony or discredit my memory or manufacture a procedural reason to throw it out. I'm an old man with no current office and no political allies. My word alone won't hold in his courtroom." "Then what will?" Margaret asked. Pratt looked at her. "The field notes," he said. "From the original survey. Those were filed with the territorial office in Denver, not the county. Foster has no reach there. If the field notes show no iron post reference, and they won't, because I remember what we recorded, and it wasn't that then you have a document from an authority outside Foster's jurisdiction that directly contradicts the altered record. We know about the field notes," Margaret said. "We're trying to get them before Whitmore's review locks the filed document into the record. We have 6 weeks." Pratt picked up his coffee cup again, a thing he seemed to do when he was thinking. "I have a brother-in-law in Denver," he said slowly. "He's nothing important, a church deacon. But he knows people, ordinary people who work ordinary jobs in ordinary offices." A pause. "Offices like the Territorial Surveyor's office." Margaret and Nathan looked at each other. "If I were to write to him this afternoon," Pratt continued, "and if he were to make a quiet inquiry on behalf of an old friend looking to verify some historical property records without triggering a formal request through county channels," he stopped. "Let them finish the sentence themselves. The field notes could be located and copied without appearing in any official request log," Margaret said. "My brother-in-law is a very thorough man," Pratt said. "He does not leave things half done." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Pratt," he said, "I have to ask you plainly, is there any risk to you in this?" Pratt looked at him with those pale, sharp eyes. "Nathan Caldwell," he said, "I have watched 3 families lose their land in this county in the past year to a man who bought a judge and altered public records. I filed those original documents with my own hands, and I will not sit in this house and drink coffee while my work is used as a weapon against the people I filed it to protect." He stood up. "I'm going to write to my brother-in-law now. You two go home, and do not speak of this conversation in Ridgeback or anywhere near Ridgeback. until I tell you I have something." They went home. Nathan drove. Margaret sat beside him, and they were both quiet the way they'd been quiet on the first day, but it was nothing like that first day. The silence then had been the silence of strangers. This was the silence of two people with too much in the same head to need words for it yet. When they were about halfway back to the ranch, Nathan said, "He's going to help us." "Yes," she said. "I didn't expect that." "He's been waiting for someone to give him a reason to," she said. "People like Pratt, they see something wrong, and it sits in them. They just need to know the effort won't be wasted." Nathan glanced at her sideways. "You knew he'd feel that way before we went." She didn't answer. "Margaret." "I thought it was likely," she said. "I didn't know." "But you thought it was worth going first thing in the morning before anyone could get ahead of us." She looked out at the land passing by. "I thought it was worth not waiting." He was quiet for another stretch. Then, "How'd a merchant's daughter from Missouri end up knowing this much about surveying records and land fraud?" The question was genuine, not pointed. She could hear the difference by now. "Same way anyone learns anything," she said. "Watching people lose things they shouldn't have had to lose, and asking myself what I'd have done differently." He nodded slowly. The wagon moved on. They came around the long bend in the road that always gave you the first view of the ranch from the east, the house and barn coming into view below the line of the mountains, and Nathan pulled up so suddenly that Margaret grabbed the seat again. "What?" There was a horse tied at the post in front of the house. A good horse. Well-kept, expensive tack. Not one of theirs. Not Ernesto's or Pete's or Hatch's. Nathan's voice came out very quiet and very flat. "That's a Whitmore horse," he said. "I've seen it in Ridgeback. It belongs to his man." Margaret's whole body went still. "He sent someone to the house," she said, "while we were gone." They looked at each other. "The rider we passed this morning," she said. "He wasn't going to Ridgeback." "He was circling back," Nathan said. "He was telling someone we'd left." They sat there for a moment, the ranch below them, the strange horse at the post, the sun starting to burn through the morning cloud. Then Margaret said, "Drive down." "Margaret." "Drive down Nathan." Her voice was completely level. "If we sit up here on this hill, we've told him we're afraid. We drive down, we go to our house, we find out who is at our door, and we deal with it." A beat. Nathan made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite anything else. He slapped the reins. They drove down. The man waiting on the porch was younger than she'd expected. Mid-30s, dressed well with the groomed look of someone who worked for money and wanted you to know the money was good. He had a leather satchel and a posture that said he'd practiced projecting confidence in the same way some men practice a fast draw. He saw them coming and didn't move from the porch. That told her something. He wasn't there to threaten. He was there to make an offer, which was in some ways worse. Nathan pulled up and stepped down from the wagon without hurrying. Margaret stepped down on her own side before Nathan could come around to help her, because she wanted to be on her feet and facing this man at the same moment. Nathan was not half a second behind. The man on the porch looked at Nathan. Then he looked at Margaret. His eyes moved over her in that particular way she had spent 30 years learning to read, the quick, assessing, ultimately dismissive survey of a man who had decided before he finished looking that she was not someone he needed to account for. He looked back at Nathan. "Mr. Caldwell," he said pleasantly. "My name is Everett Cole. I work for Harrison Whitmore's development interests. I wonder if I might have a few minutes of your time." Nathan looked at him for a long moment. "You're on my porch," he said. Cole smiled slightly. "Waiting only. No one answered the door, so I waited." "You're still on my porch." A small pause. Cole adjusted the satchel in his hand. "Of course. May I come in?" "No," Nathan said. "Say what you came to say." Another small pause, longer this time, recalibrating. "Mr. Whitmore is interested in acquiring land in this area," Cole said. He's prepared to make a generous offer for the Caldwell Ranch. I have the figures here. He patted the satchel. I think you'll find... We're not selling, Nathan said. Cole's smile stayed in place. Of course it's not a decision to make quickly. I'd encourage you to at least look at the offer before... My husband said we're not selling. Margaret said it quietly from beside Nathan, her eyes on Cole's face. The answer is no. Today and any other day you come back. Cole looked at her, and there it was again, that look. The longer version of it this time, with something behind it that was closer to contempt than dismissal, the look of a man who found her presence here not just irrelevant, but faintly ridiculous. Mrs. Caldwell, he said with a particular careful pleasantness that was somehow worse than rudeness. This is a significant business matter. I'm sure Mr. Caldwell will want to consider all the... Mr. Cole? Her voice didn't rise. It didn't sharpen. It simply became something that you couldn't talk over. I manage this ranch's accounts. I handle its property records. I am the person on this property who knows exactly what we own, and exactly what it's worth, and exactly why the offer in your satchel will be considerably lower than what this land is actually valued at. If you have something to say about this ranch's business, you can say it to both of us, or you can get back on your horse. Cole looked at her. Then he looked at Nathan. Nathan was watching Cole with the flat, cold expression of a man waiting to see which way something breaks. Cole recalibrated again. His smile was thinner now. I'll leave the offer with you, he said, reaching into the satchel. Mr. Whitmore's timeline is 4 weeks. After that, the terms change. Leave it on the rail, Nathan said. He didn't move toward it. Cole placed the sealed envelope on the porch railing. He looked at them both one more time, at Nathan, with professional assessment at Margaret, with something that hadn't made up its mind yet, what it wanted to be. Then he tipped his hat. Good day, he said. He got on his horse and rode back toward the east, and Nathan and Margaret stood in the yard and watched him go, and neither of them touched the envelope on the railing. When the dust settled back into the road, Nathan picked up the envelope. He didn't open it. He turned it over once in his hands. 4 weeks, he said. They moved it up, she said. The review must have been moved up too. Whitmore's applying pressure on both ends. He wants you running the numbers, looking at the offer, thinking about whether you can hold on before the field notes arrive. She paused. He wants you worried. Nathan looked at her. Are you? He said. She looked back at him steadily. I'm angry, she said. That's different. Something moved through his expression, quick and unguarded there, and gone in a second, but she caught it. She was getting better at catching the things Nathan tried not to show. He handed her the envelope. Open it, he said. Let's see what we're dealing with. She opened it. She looked at the number. Then she looked at Nathan. It's less than half the real value, she said. I know. He knows we know that. He does. Which means he's not making an offer, she said. He's making a statement. Nathan nodded slowly. He's telling us how far along his plan already is, he said. If he believed we could fight him, the number would be higher. The number is that low because he believes we can't. Margaret folded the offer and put it in her pocket. Then our job, she said, is to make sure he's wrong. She went inside. Nathan stood in the yard for another moment, looking east at the road where Cole had gone, and then he turned and looked at the house at the kitchen window, where Margaret had already appeared, had already set the kettle on, was already doing what she did, which was move forward. And he felt something settle in his chest. Something solid. Something that had no good name yet, but that felt in a way nothing had felt in 6 years, like the ground holding. He went inside. Ernesto came in at noon with news Nathan hadn't expected. The fence on the south pasture was cut. Not broken. Not fallen. Cut. Clean through 3 posts in a row right at the creek boundary. Pete had found it first thing in the morning and spent 3 hours repairing it before Ernesto realized what Pete had initially thought was an animal break was something entirely different, and came to tell Nathan himself. Nathan's face went through something Margaret had not seen on him before. It lasted only a second, a flash of something raw and furious that went all the way down before it was replaced by the same controlled flatness he wore when he was thinking rather than reacting. "Anyone see anything?" he said. "Not in the night," Ernesto said. "Pete was up at 4:30 and checked the barn. Nothing then. Must have been done between midnight and 4. "Same night Cole was here," Margaret said. The three of them were quiet for a moment. "He's not just making an offer," Nathan said. "No," she agreed. "He's showing you what they can do on your own property while you're sleeping." Ernesto looked at Nathan with an expression Margaret was glad to see, the expression of a man who had made a decision, clear-eyed and complete. "I can sleep in the south barn," he said. "Hatch too if he's willing. Any night work will see it." "No," Nathan said. "I won't put you in that position. You're not putting me anywhere," Ernesto said quietly. "This is my place too. I've worked this land 11 years. Nathan looked at him. Margaret watched Nathan look at him. And she saw something cross Nathan's face that she had not seen there before either. Not the controlled flatness, not the grief, not the careful distance. Something older and simpler than any of that. Gratitude. Real gratitude, the kind that knows it isn't owed. "All right," Nathan said quietly. "Thank you." Ernesto nodded and went out. Nathan stood at the kitchen table with his palms flat on the surface, looking at nothing for a moment. Margaret watched him and waited. "They're going to keep doing this," he said. "Between now and whenever the field notes come, if they come, they're going to keep pulling at this place. Find things to cut, things to delay, things to make me look at the offer and wonder if it's worth the fight." "Yes," she said simply, "and there's not much I can do about most of it tonight." "No, not tonight." He looked at her. "What do we do tomorrow?" "Tomorrow," she said. "I'm going to write down everything, every incident, every date, every name. Cole's visit, the fence, the rider we passed on Crestwood Road, the survey document discrepancy, all of it in order, documented, witnessed where possible." She pulled out her notebook from the shelf. "If we ever stand in front of someone who is actually listening, I want a record that tells the story so clearly and so plainly that no one can say it's one man's word against another's." Nathan was quiet for a long moment. "You've been thinking about this a long time," he said. "I've been thinking about it since the day Ernesto told me Whitmore's name," she said. He looked at the notebook in her hands. "My father lost everything because nobody wrote anything down," she said. It came out quieter than she intended. "Because it was all agreements and handshakes, and everyone thought everyone else remembered, and when the trouble came there was nothing. No paper, no witness. Nothing that could be held in front of someone and said, 'Here, this is what happened.'" She pressed her hand flat against the notebook cover. "I'm not going to let that happen here." Nathan Caldwell looked at Margaret Ellis for a long moment in the late afternoon light of that kitchen. And then he said quietly, without preamble, without any visible plan for saying it, "I'm glad you came." She held his gaze. She could feel all the careful walls she'd built around everything she felt about this man and this house and this place straining against those 4 words like a river against a dam. She didn't let them break, but she let them bend. "So am I," she said. She opened the notebook and she began to write. The letter from Gideon Pratt's brother-in-law arrived on a Thursday morning, 17 days after they'd driven out to Crestwood Road. Margaret was at the kitchen table when Nathan came in from the barn, holding its still sealed mud on his boots, and something careful in his expression that she'd learned by now meant he was trying to read a situation before committing to a feeling about it. He set it on the table in front of her. She looked at the handwriting on the front. Then she looked up at him. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She opened it. She read it once through without speaking. Then she laid it flat on the table and pushed it toward Nathan and watched his face as he read it. He read it slowly. She knew the moment he reached the 3rd paragraph because his jaw went tight and something shifted behind his eyes. Not surprise exactly. More like a man who had hoped he was wrong about something and just found out he was right. He put the letter down. "They found the field notes," she said. "They found them," he agreed. And the iron post reference is not in them, not on any page. The original survey recorded a stone marker at the base of the ridge, same as the deed. The water rights boundary in the field notes matches what you've been working from for 12 years. She pressed her finger to the second page of the letter. Pratt's brother-in-law had a colleague copy the relevant pages. They're being sent separately by separate post on different days, in case one gets intercepted. Nathan stared at her. He thought of that himself, he said. Gideon Pratt apparently has a very thorough family, she said. Nathan leaned back in his chair. He breathed out slowly through his nose the way he did when something large was moving through him, and he was managing the pace of it. We have the proof, he said. We have the copies. The originals are still in Denver. But we can prove the alteration. We can prove a discrepancy between what was filed at the county and what the original field notes recorded, she said carefully. A lawyer would argue that proves alteration. Whitmore's lawyer would argue it proves a clerical error or transcription mistake. The question is where we take it and who decides. Not Foster. Not Foster, she agreed. Which means county court is off the table. We need to go to the territorial level. Nathan was quiet for a moment. That means Denver, he said. That means Denver. Crane can help us file the right paperwork, but someone needs to go in person. The Territorial Land Commissioner has the authority to freeze a local review pending investigation of a fraudulent document claim. If we can get a freeze on Whitmore's review, it buys us time to build the full case. Nathan looked at her steadily. How long do we have before the copied field notes arrive? 5 days, maybe 6. The offer timeline Whitmore gave was 4 weeks from Cole's visit. That's, he thought, 11 days from now. Whitmore's review is still scheduled inside that window, she said. If we don't get the freeze before the review completes and locks the record, the copied field notes become evidence in a dispute rather than evidence stopping a fraudulent process. The bar is much higher. Nathan stood up. He walked to the window. He stood there the way he did when he was thinking something through to its end before turning around. Margaret waited. I'd need to go to Denver myself, he said without turning. Crane can't do this remotely. Someone with standing on the property needs to make the formal complaint in person. Yes. That's 3 days of travel, maybe 4. Yes. He turned around. Which leaves you here. She met his eyes. I'm aware. With Whitmore's men watching this property. I'm aware of that too. He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him working through it. The worry, the logistics, the particular discomfort of a man who had learned to manage everything himself, suddenly having someone here that he didn't want to leave unprotected. She kept her voice level. Ernesto and Hatch are here. I know where the rifle is, and I know how to use it. I'll be careful about what I say in town, and I won't go anywhere alone. She paused. And Nathan, every day you don't go is a day we lose. He knew she was right. She could see that he knew. I'll ride to Crane this afternoon, he said. We'll work out what I need to bring to Denver. I'll have copies of everything ready by tonight, she said. He nodded, picked up his hat. Then he stopped. He didn't turn around for a moment. When he did, his voice was quieter than usual. Not soft. Nathan Caldwell's voice was never quite soft, but quieter. The difference between a man speaking and a man choosing to speak. If something goes wrong while I'm gone, he said, if Whitmore sends Cole or anyone else to this house, I'll handle it. I know you will. A pause. That's not what I was going to say. She waited. If something goes wrong, he said, I need you to go to Pratt, not to town, to Pratt. He'll know what to do, and he won't be pressured. She looked at him. All right. Promise me. It was the first time he'd ever asked her to promise him anything. I promise, she said. He nodded once, put his hat on, walked out. Margaret sat at the kitchen table for a moment after the door closed. She pressed both palms flat on the surface and breathed. Then she pulled the notebook toward her and went back to work. Nathan left for Denver before dawn, 2 mornings later, with a saddlebag full of documents, and Aldous Crane's written instructions, and a look on his face when he said goodbye that Margaret chose not to examine too closely. He said, "Ride to Pratt." She said she would. He held her gaze for one moment longer than necessary. Then he turned his horse east, and was gone before the first real light came over the mountains. The ranch felt different without him. Not smaller, it was still 14 miles of Colorado land, and it kept all its demands. But quieter in a particular way that had nothing to do with noise. Margaret noticed it the first morning, and then refused to keep noticing it, which was about as effective as it always is. She threw herself into work with the focus of a woman who understands that motion is its own defense against thought. She finished the fall accounting ahead of schedule. She reorganized the supply records. She dried and preserved the last of the garden harvest with the kind of methodical intensity that Ernesto, who brought the baskets in without being asked, watched with a quiet respect he'd never voiced, but that she felt anyway. On the second day, Pete came to her. She was in the kitchen when she heard him at the door, that particular tentative knock that wasn't quite tentative enough to be polite, the knock of a young man who hadn't decided yet whether he wanted to be there or not. "Come in, Pete," she said without turning from the stove. He came in, stood just inside the door. "I got something to tell you," he said. She turned around then. He looked uncomfortable. Not afraid Pete wasn't a boy who showed fear easily, or at all, which was part of his problem, but uncomfortable in the way of someone who had decided to do a right thing and found the doing of it harder than expected. "Then tell me," she said. "There was a man at the south fence 2 nights ago," he said. "Not cutting it, just looking. Walked the line for about an hour, then left." Margaret set down what she was holding. "Did you see his face?" "Not clearly. But the horse?" He stopped. "The horse," she prompted. "Same horse Cole rode when he came to the house," he said. "I remember the blaze on its nose, unusual shape. Did you tell Ernesto?" Pete looked at the floor briefly. "No, ma'am." "Why not?" A pause. "Because I didn't think it was my place. Because I wasn't sure." He looked up. "Because I was going to wait and see if it happened again." Margaret looked at him steadily. "Pete," she said not unkindly, "when someone is building a case against your ranch, they don't always do it in ways that look like crimes in the moment. Walking a fence line is not illegal. Looking at property is not illegal. But when I write it down in my record alongside everything else, it becomes part of a pattern. Do you understand?" He nodded. "Every single thing you see that is unusual on or near this property you tell me or Ernesto immediately. Not when you decide it's relevant. Not after you've thought about it for 2 days. Immediately." She held his gaze. "Can you do that?" "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Good." She turned back to the stove. "Sit down. I'll fix you something." He sat. She heard him behind her adjusting the chair, the way young men do when they're not sure if they're supposed to be comfortable, and she didn't say anything about it, and after a minute, he settled. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said. "Margaret," she said. Another small adjustment. "Margaret." A pause. "I was wrong to talk to you the way I did when you first came." She didn't stop what she was doing. "Yes, you were." "I'm sorry." "I know," she said. She put a plate down in front of him. "Eat your food." He ate. And that, as far as Margaret was concerned, was that. She wrote down the fence line observation in the notebook when Pete left. She added it to the record date-time description of the horse. Then she sat back and looked at what she had built over these weeks, and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing done right, the same feeling she'd had as a girl, sitting with her father's accounts at the end of a long evening when all the numbers resolved and the truth of a thing was visible and clear. The truth here was visible. The question was who was going to be in the room when it came out. She was thinking about that still at the kitchen table with the notebook open when she heard the sound of a wagon on the road. Not Nathan too early, and Nathan had taken the horse. She went to the window. It was a woman. Not anyone she recognized. A woman about her own age, maybe a few years older, in a practical blue dress, with a child on the seat beside her, a girl of maybe 8 with her mother's dark hair. The wagon pulled up to the post, and the woman looked at the house and then looked searchingly at Margaret in the window. Margaret went to the door. "Mrs. Caldwell," the woman called. "That's right. My name is Ruth Orville." She said it the way people say their name when they're not sure of the reception clearly but prepared. "My family had the Orville cattle operation out on the flats. Whitmore bought us out 18 months ago." A pause. "I heard Nathan Caldwell's new wife was fighting his land case. I'd like to talk to you if you'll have me." Margaret came out onto the porch. She looked at Ruth Orville for a moment, at the composed face and the careful eyes, and the particular way a person holds themselves when they've been through something difficult, and came out the other side still standing, not undamaged, but upright. "Come in," she said. "I'll put coffee on." Ruth Orville came in. The little girl, her name was Clara, which landed quietly in the space between Margaret and the kitchen, with a weight Margaret absorbed without remarking on, sat at the table, and accepted a biscuit, and looked at everything with the serious attention of a child who has learned to read rooms. Ruth wrapped her hands around the coffee cup and said, "I should have fought harder. I know that now. But my husband was sick, and the judge threw out our evidence, and there was no one who could tell us how to get around Foster." She looked at Margaret. "I heard what happened with the fence. Talk gets around out here." "What else has gotten around?" Margaret asked. "That Whitmore's man came to this house with an offer while Nathan was away. That the offer was low enough to be an insult." Ruth's eyes were steady. "And that you sent him off the porch." "We sent him off the porch," Margaret said. "Nathan was here." "That's not how Everett Cole tells it in town," Ruth said. Margaret was still for a moment. "How does Cole tell it?" "He says Nathan Caldwell has let his mail-order wife take over his operation, that she's run off his common sense, along with his hired hand's respect, and that she's going to talk him into losing his land because she doesn't understand what she's dealing with." Ruth held her gaze. "He's saying it loud enough that people are hearing it." Margaret felt something move through her, not quite anger, not quite anything that simple. Something colder and more deliberate. "He's trying to isolate Nathan," she said. "Yes. If the people in Ridgeback believe Nathan's judgment has been compromised, then, when Nathan comes back from Denver with a territorial complaint, the community reaction will be skepticism rather than support." She paused. "And this case needs community support. A corrupt judge can ignore one man's complaint. He can't ignore a county full of people who watched a land fraud happen in front of them." Ruth nodded. She'd thought this through too. Margaret could see that. "That's why I came," Ruth said quietly. "Because the Orvilles weren't the only family. There are 2 others I know of who believe they were pushed out unfairly. The Hennessy farm, north of the creek, and old Gus Marlowe, who had the grazing rights on the eastern ridge. They sold because they felt they had no choice, same as us." She paused. "If Nathan's case goes forward, if it actually gets a real hearing, their situations get looked at too." Margaret looked at her. "Would they testify?" she said. "I would," Ruth said. "And I think the others would if someone asked them the right way. If they thought the effort would actually go somewhere instead of ending up in front of Harlan Foster." "It won't be Foster," Margaret said. "Nathan's filing at the territorial level." Something crossed Ruth Orville's face. "Can he do that? Go around the county?" "If the fraud involved tampering with territorial records, yes. A federal land commissioner can supersede a county judge's jurisdiction." She paused. "Aldous Crane is helping with the filing." Ruth sat back slightly. "Crane's honest." "I believe so." "He couldn't help us. Orville case never made it past the county." "This one won't go through the county," Margaret said. "That's the difference." Ruth was quiet for a long moment. She looked at little Clara, who had finished her biscuit and was now watching the 2 women with that same serious reading-the-room attention. "What do you need from me?" Ruth said. "Your account," Margaret said. "Written, signed, dated. Everything that happened with your land sale, every meeting, every document, every threat or pressure or unusual circumstance. The same way I've been keeping our record. If we can put your account beside ours and the Hennessy's and Marlowe's, we're not presenting one man's complaint. We're presenting a pattern of conduct. Ruth nodded slowly. I can write it. Write it tonight, Margaret said, while it's fresh in your head from saying it out loud. And Ruth, she held her gaze. Don't tell anyone else you've been here, not until Nathan is back and we know where things stand. Ruth looked at her for a moment with those steady, careful eyes. You're good at this, she said. It wasn't flattery. It was observation. My father was a merchant, Margaret said. I watched him lose everything because nobody built the case properly. I'm building this one properly. Ruth left before noon with Margaret's assurance that she'd be in contact when Nathan returned, and with little Clara's hand tucked in hers, and a straightness in her walk that hadn't been there when she arrived. Margaret stood on the porch watching them go, and thought about what Ruth had said about Cole's campaign in town, about the deliberate erosion of confidence in Nathan's judgment about the way Whitmore worked. Not straight at a man, around him. Through the opinions of other people, through the slow poisoning of the well, until by the time he made his real move, the man's allies had already been persuaded to stand aside. She went back inside. She sat at the kitchen table. She picked up her pen. She wrote Cole's name at the top of a new page, and then she wrote down everything Ruth Orville had told her, and then she began methodically, and with the focus of a woman who has found the work she was built for, to think about how you beat a man who operates in the space between what can be proven and what everyone knows. The fourth night after Nathan left, the cattle got out. It was Hatch who came to wake her, a soft knock at her door at 2 a.m, apologetic and urgent at once. She was dressed and at the door in under a minute. South Pasture Gate, he said. It was open. Maybe 12 head got through, maybe more. Ernesto and Pete are already out. The latch, she said. He looked at her. The latch hatch. Was it broken or was it just open? A pause. Just open. Margaret looked at him. All right, she said. Go help them. I'll wait here. She paused. And Hatch, when you find all the cattle, count them twice. She lit every lamp in the house while she waited. She wasn't afraid exactly. Fear was something that happened when you didn't know what was coming. She knew what was coming. She just didn't know yet exactly what form it was going to take. They brought the cattle back in just over 2 hours. 12 head, all accounted for no injury. The gate latch was intact, no damage, no sign of failure. Someone had opened it from the outside. Ernesto told her this standing in the kitchen doorway with hay on his jacket and a look in his eyes that had gone past tired into something harder. Third thing this week, he said. After the rider at the fence and the, I know, she said. Sit down, all 3 of you. They sat. She put coffee in front of them. They're escalating. She said not to any one of them in particular. The fence cut was a threat. The rider walking the line was surveillance. Now they're interfering directly with the operation. She looked at Ernesto. They want this place to look like it's coming apart before Nathan gets back. They want him to come home to damage and disorder, and then look at that offer and think the fight isn't worth it. Pete said from the other end of the table. What do we do? Tonight you sleep, she said. Tomorrow we fix the gate latch, replace it entirely something heavier, and we put Hatch in the south barn at night starting tomorrow. And I'm going to ride to Gideon Pratt in the morning. Ernesto looked up sharply. Nathan said if there was trouble, she began. Nathan said exactly right, Ernesto said. I'll ride with you. I need you here. Then Pete rides with you. She started to say she didn't need an escort, and then she looked at Ernesto's face and decided that this was not the moment for that particular principle. Fine, she said. Pete. Pete straightened in his chair. Yes, ma'am, he said. She went to Pratt the next morning with Pete riding alongside and the notebook under her arm, and she told Pratt everything. The fence, the rider, the gate, Ruth Orville Cole's campaign in Ridgeback, all of it, in order the way she'd recorded it. Pratt listened, the way he always listened, which was without interruption and without visible emotion. Just the quiet absorption of a man taking in information and sorting it. When she finished, he said, "Cole is talking in town." "I know. He's been particularly pointed about the fact that Nathan left an inexperienced woman in charge of a contested property." He looked at her. "He's using your size." She met his eyes. She knew what that meant. She'd known it since the day she stepped off the stagecoach and saw every person in Ridgeback do the same inventory Cole's eyes had done on Nathan's porch. She'd known it before she left Missouri, had known it in the way a woman knows the conditions of the landscape she's walking into. It didn't feel like surprise. It felt like a rock in the chest that she'd been carrying long enough that she sometimes forgot it was there until someone reminded her. "What is he saying?" she asked. That Nathan was embarrassed by the arrangement, that he took the first woman who'd have him and ended up with someone who can't manage a household, let alone a land dispute, that she's the reason the cattle got out. Pratt paused. He's not saying these things to mean men. He's saying them to ordinary men who will then say them to their wives who will think about them, and some of them will wonder. Margaret held his gaze steadily. Does it matter what they wonder? It matters if it gets back to the Territorial Commissioner's office before Nathan's filing is reviewed, Pratt said. A commissioner who's heard that the Caldwell operation is in chaos and the man's new wife is in over her head is going to look at a complaint about land fraud with a different eye than one who hasn't. Then we need the community narrative to be different before Nathan gets back, she said. Yes, Pratt said. We do. She looked at him. Do you go to church, Mr. Pratt? He looked at her with those pale, sharp eyes. I do, he said slowly. And I imagine a man who filed county records for 40 years knows most of the people in this community. I'd say that's accurate. Then I'd like to ask you something. She leaned forward slightly. Not as a favor, as part of the same work you said you wanted to do when we sat in your kitchen and you told me you'd watched 3 families lose their land. She held his gaze. The people who need to hear the truth about what Whitmore has been doing in this county, I need them to hear it from someone they trust before Nathan walks into Ridgeback. Not from me, not yet. From someone with 40 years of standing in this community. Pratt was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, There's a gathering at the Hendersons on Saturday. Families from this side of the county. It's informal, nothing official about it. Will Cole or anyone from Whitmore's operation be there? No. Too far out for them to bother. Will the Hennessy's be there, Marlowe? Pratt looked at her with what she was starting to recognize as the closest thing he had to surprised. You know about the Hennessy's and Marlowe. Ruth Orville came to see me. He made a sound that was almost but not quite a laugh. That woman has a head on her shoulders. She does, Margaret said. So Saturday. I'll be there, he said, and I'll say what needs to be said. She stood to go. Mrs. Caldwell, Pratt said. She looked back. Cole is right about one thing, he said. Her chin came up slightly. You are running this operation, he said. He just thinks that's a problem. The pale eyes held something in them she hadn't seen before. I don't. She nodded once and went out to where Pete was waiting with the horses, and she got into the saddle, and they started back toward the ranch, and she let herself feel exactly 10 seconds of something that was pure, uncomplicated relief before she filed it away and started thinking about the next thing. Nathan came back on the 6th day. She heard the horse on the road before she could see him, and she knew it was him. She knew the sound of his horse's gait, which was something she hadn't known she'd memorized until it was right there, as certain as anything she'd ever known. She was standing on the porch when he rode up. He looked tired, the kind of tired that was more than travel, the kind that accumulates when you're carrying a weight of uncertainty for several days without knowing how it's going to resolve. He slid down from the horse and handed the reins to Pete, who appeared from the barn with perfect timing that Margaret suspected was not accidental. Nathan came to the porch. He looked at her. Well, she said. The Territorial Commissioner agreed to review the complaint, he said. Crane's filing was received. The review of Whitmore's water rights claim is officially frozen pending investigation. Margaret breathed. They're pulling the field notes from Denver as part of the investigation, Nathan continued. Formally through official channels. Crane says that makes them part of the record, not just evidence we brought ourselves. That's better than we hoped, she said. Yes. He was still looking at her. How are things here? The cattle got out one night. We got them all back. The gate latch has been replaced. Hatch has been sleeping in the south barn. Nathan's jaw went tight. Who opened the gate? We don't know. I've documented it. What else? Ruth Orville came to see me. She'll testify. Hennessy and Marlowe are considering it. Gideon Pratt spoke at the Henderson gathering Saturday about Whitmore's land practices in this county. She paused. Cole has been in Ridgeback working against us, saying things about the operation about me, about your judgment in this situation. Nathan's expression had gone through several things during this list. She watched it. Saying things about you, he said. It doesn't matter. It matters to me. She looked at him. Nathan. What did he say? She told him, plainly without embroidering it or softening it, because that was how she said hard things. She watched him listen, watched the controlled flatness come over his face, but underneath it this time was something she hadn't seen there aimed at something outside before. Something specific and personal and completely uncontrolled. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said very quietly, Cole is going to regret that. What are you going to do? He looked at her. Not what he'd expect, he said. She waited. He expects me to come into town angry and defensive, Nathan said. He expects me to show up proving his point that I've lost my head over a woman who's got me turned around. That's the narrative he's built. He paused. So I'm not going to do that. What are you going to do instead? I'm going to walk into Ridgeback with my wife, he said, and I'm going to do business the way I've always done business, and I'm going to let every person in that town see that this operation is exactly as solid as it has ever been, that the man standing beside his wife isn't a man who lost his judgment. He's a man who found better judgment than he had alone. Margaret looked at him. Something moved through her. Not the careful banked warmth of the past weeks, not the measured self-protective thing she'd been managing since the first day on that wagon. Something fuller than that, something that didn't have good walls around it. She didn't look away. When do we go to town? She said. Tomorrow morning, he said. Early. She nodded. He didn't move to go inside. He stood there on the porch and looked at her in the last light of the day, and she looked back, and neither of them said what was actually present in that moment, because neither of them was ready for those words, not yet. But they both felt it. And neither of them pretended they didn't. Come inside, she said finally. I kept supper. Margaret. She stopped at the door. Thank you, he said. For all of it. For every single thing. She held the door frame. We had a deal, she said. I came here to help. You did more than that. She looked at him. Yes, she said quietly. I suppose I did. She went inside. He followed. And in Ridgeback, in the office above the dry goods store, Everett Cole sat down with a telegram that had arrived that afternoon and read it twice, and then set it flat on the desk with a look on his face that was not the comfortable look of a man whose plan is proceeding. It was the look of a man who had just realized that the thing he'd been trying to knock over was considerably more solid than it appeared. Harrison Whitmore's telegram said 3 words. Handle it now. Cole looked out the window toward the western road. He picked up his pen. They rode into Ridgeback the next morning side by side, Nathan on his horse and Margaret on the wagon seat, with her back straight and her hands easy on the reins. And if anyone watching from the storefronts along Main Street had expected to see a man diminished, or a woman uncertain, they were going to be disappointed. Nathan had said it the night before quietly over the last of the supper. She'd kept warm for him. They would not arrive looking like people defending themselves. They would arrive looking like people who had nothing to defend. Margaret understood the difference. She'd spent enough years walking into rooms that hadn't made space for her to know that the way you came through a door was half the argument before you said a single word. They tied up in front of Crane's office first. Aldous Crane met them at the door with the look of a man who had news and had been holding it carefully since early morning. He shook Nathan's hand and nodded to Margaret and let them both inside, and then closed the door behind him, which told her the news was not for the street. "Sit down," he said. They sat. "The Territorial Commissioner's office sent a confirmation this morning," Crane said. He placed a single page on the desk between them. "The freeze on Whitmore's review is official and in writing. Any county-level action on the disputed water rights boundary is suspended pending the federal investigation." He paused. "And there's something else." Margaret and Nathan looked at him. "The investigator assigned to the case is a man named Samuel Briggs. He's out of the Denver office, federal appointment, no connection to county politics." Crane folded his hands on the desk. "I know Briggs. He's thorough, he's honest, and he does not like being made to look foolish. If the field notes show what your records suggest, they show Briggs will not let it go quietly." Nathan leaned forward. "When does Briggs arrive?" "He's already in the territory," Crane said. "He came with the morning stage from Pueblo. He wants to meet with both of you this afternoon." Margaret looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at her. "This afternoon," Nathan said, "at 3 o'clock, here." Crane met their eyes in turn. "I want to be clear about something before you go in there. Briggs is on your side in the sense that he wants the truth. He is not on your side in the sense of wanting a particular outcome. He will ask hard questions. He will ask them of both of you. And if there is anything in your account that doesn't hold up to examination, he will find it." "There's nothing that won't hold up," Margaret said. Crane looked at her. "You're certain? Every claim in that notebook is documented and dated. Every discrepancy is cross-referenced to the original documents. Ruth Orville's written account corroborates the pattern of conduct independently. Gideon Pratt can testify to the original recording standards." She paused. "Yes, I'm certain." Crane nodded slowly. "Then you'll be fine," he said. They left his office and walked the length of Main Street together, and Margaret felt the attention of the town, the way you feel weather coming. Not one gust, but a general shift in the atmosphere, heads turning in the way of people who had been told a version of a story and were now looking at the subjects of it and reconsidering. Nathan tipped his hat to a man outside the feed store. The man, after a half-second's hesitation, tipped his back. Margaret kept her pace steady. A woman she didn't know crossed from the other side of the street toward them, which in a town this size at a moment like this was a deliberate act. "Mr. Caldwell," the woman said. Then she looked at Margaret. "Mrs. Caldwell, I'm Eleanor Hennessy. My husband James has the farm north of the creek." She held Margaret's gaze. "Ruth Orville told us what you're doing. I want you to know that James is prepared to give his account to whoever needs to hear it." "Thank you, Mrs. Hennessy," Margaret said. "That may matter more than you know." Eleanor Hennessy nodded. She glanced once briefly pointedly toward the far end of the street, where Everett Cole was standing outside the land office, watching this exchange. Then she looked back at Margaret with an expression that communicated clearly, and without words, exactly what she thought of Everett Cole. She went back the way she came. Nathan said nothing until they were past the next building. Then very quietly, "You've been busy." "Someone had to be," she said. He glanced at her sideways. The left corner of his mouth did the thing it did when he was trying not to show what he was feeling, which by now she could read at 20 paces. "I'm not complaining," he said. "I know," she said. Cole came to them before they made it back to the wagon. She'd expected it. He'd been watching them from the land office since they came off Crane's steps, and she'd tracked him in her peripheral vision the whole length of the street, with the same calm attention she gave to anything she needed to understand before it reached her. He was alone. That was the first thing she noted. Last time he'd had the authority of his satchel and the surprise of their empty house. Now he was on a public street in broad daylight with half the town watching, and he was alone. He came at Nathan directly. Caldwell. He didn't bother with pleasantries this time. The smile was gone. What replaced it was the expression of a man who had received a telegram that said, "Handle it now," and understood what happened if he didn't. "You've made a filing with the Territorial Commission." "I have," Nathan said. "That's a significant step." Cole's voice was measured, but underneath it was a current of something that wasn't quite as controlled as he wanted it to be. "Mr. Whitmore's offer is still on the table. It won't be after today." "Then it won't be," Nathan said. Cole looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Margaret. He'd calibrated his approach since the porch. She could see that. He wasn't going to dismiss her this time. He'd made that mistake once, and he knew she could see that he knew that it had cost him. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said. His voice had the particular careful pleasantness of a man who has learned the weapon he was using doesn't work and is trying to find a new one while appearing not to. "I wonder if I might speak with you honestly for a moment." "You can try," she said. Something shifted in his face. He decided on an approach and committed to it. "You're a capable woman," he said, and he said it in the tone of a man offering something he expects to be appreciated. "Anyone can see that, and you've clearly worked hard on behalf of this ranch and this man." He paused. "But this county is complicated. The relationships here go back decades. The politics go back further. What looks like a winning case to someone looking at documents." He stopped, recalibrated. "You could win in Denver and still lose here. Whitmore has interests in this territory that aren't going to disappear because of a federal investigator. The man who continues fighting a force like that doesn't win. He just loses more slowly." He let that sit. Nathan started to speak. Margaret put her hand on his arm. "Just briefly, just enough." He stopped. She looked at Cole. "Mr. Cole," she said, "you came to our porch with an offer. We said no. You had the fence cut and the gate opened. We documented it. You went to the people in this town and said things about me and about my husband's judgment." She held his gaze without blinking. "And now you're standing on this street telling me that the man who keeps fighting loses more slowly." Cole said nothing. "The reason you're saying that," she continued, "is because the freeze on the review came through this morning. And you know what happens when Samuel Briggs compares the county water rights document to the original field notes. You know what he's going to find. And you know that a federal investigator finding document fraud in a territorial land office is not a thing that gets managed quietly, regardless of who Harrison Whitmore knows in this county." She paused. "So the offer isn't on the table anymore. Fine. We don't want the offer. We want our water rights and our land and the record corrected, and that's exactly what we're going to get." Cole looked at her. For a moment, just a moment, something moved in his face that was less calculation and more plain, unmanaged reaction. Not anger. Something closer to the specific discomfort of a man who has organized his understanding of a person and finds it is substantially wrong. He looked at Nathan. Nathan looked back at him with the flat, cold expression of a man who is waiting for this to be over. Cole put his hat on. "Good day," he said. He walked back toward the land office and did not look behind him. Nathan stood beside Margaret on the sidewalk and watched him go. "You knew Briggs had arrived," he said. "Crane told us when we came in," she said. "You knew Cole didn't know you knew." "I thought it was likely." She looked up at him. "Was that all right?" Nathan looked at her for a long moment. "Margaret," he said, "if you ever ask me that again, I'm going to be genuinely insulted." She almost smiled. They went back to Crane's office at 3 o'clock, and Samuel Briggs was already there. He was a compact, methodical man in his mid-50s with the look of someone who had spent decades making sure his opinions were only as large as his evidence, which gave him a natural stillness that Margaret respected immediately. He shook hands with both of them, sat down, opened a leather folder, and looked at them with clear, assessing eyes. "I've reviewed the filing Mr. Crane submitted," he said. "I have some questions." "Go ahead," Nathan said. Briggs looked at Margaret. "Mrs. Caldwell, the filing indicates you were the one who identified the discrepancy between the deed and the water rights document." "That's correct," she said. "Walk me through it. Exactly what you found and in what order. She walked him through it. Every step, every reference, every cross-check she'd done in the order she'd done it. Briggs listened without interrupting, making occasional notes in his leather folder. When she finished, he looked at his notes for a moment. "The notebook," he said. "The ongoing record you've kept of incidents and evidence. Do you have it with you?" She put it on the desk. He opened it. He read through it, not skimming, actually reading, which she appreciated. He turned pages carefully. He stopped at Ruth Orville's account, which Margaret had folded inside the back cover. "Orville," he said. "She came to me voluntarily," Margaret said. "Her family sold their land 18 months ago under what she believes was a fraudulent process. She's prepared to testify. There are others, Hennessy and Marlowe. I spoke to Eleanor Hennessy this morning. Her husband is prepared to give his account." Briggs looked at her over the notebook. "You've been building a case," he said. "I've been keeping a record," she said. "What it becomes is up to people like you." Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile. Briggs didn't seem like a man who smiled easily at work, but a shift toward the positive end of neutral. He looked at Nathan. "The field notes from the original survey. You have copies." "They arrived before I left for Denver," Nathan said. "Margaret has them." She produced them from the document folder she'd brought. Briggs took them. He laid them beside the county water rights document that was part of the filing. He looked from one to the other for a long moment. "No iron post reference," he said. "Not on any page," Margaret said. "The boundary description uses a stone marker at the base of the ridge, same as the deed." Briggs set both documents flat on the desk. He looked at them for another moment with the expression of a man confirming something he'd already concluded. "The alteration is not subtle," he said. "Whoever changed this document did not expect anyone to go back to the field notes. The language difference is significant enough that a clerical error explanation won't hold." He closed his folder. "I'm going to need to speak with the county land recorder. And with Gideon Pratt." "Pratt is expecting you," Nathan said. "He told me yesterday he'd be available whenever you needed him." Briggs nodded. He looked at them both. "I need to tell you something," he said. "The investigation I conduct here is a federal matter. Its outcome does not depend on county politics or on who Judge Foster is friendly with. But the process takes time. The freeze protects your water rights in the interim. But Whitmore's legal team will challenge it. They'll file motions. They'll try to slow the process." He paused. "You need to be prepared to hold on for several more weeks, possibly longer." "We'll hold on," Nathan said. Briggs looked at Margaret. She held his gaze steadily. "We'll hold on," she said. What happened next did not come from the direction they were watching. They were 3 days past the meeting with Briggs Nathan, back at the full work of the ranch, and Margaret back at the accounts and the record and the garden that was coming into a late bloom, with the marigolds running along the south bed in their close-spaced rows, when Ernesto came to the house in the middle of the morning with a look that made her put her pen down before he said a word. "There's a man in town saying Nathan forged the original deed," Ernesto said. Margaret went very still. "Who?" she said. "Man named Dawes. He says he was a witness at the original signing. Says Nathan added parcels to the deed that weren't agreed on." Ernesto's voice was controlled, but underneath it was a shaking that he was managing with visible effort. "He's saying it at the feed store and the post office, and he's willing to say it to Briggs." Margaret stood up. She was thinking faster than she could organize into words, but the shape of it was already clear. This was Whitmore's response to the freeze. You couldn't stop a federal investigation with local politics, but you could muddy it. You could introduce a counter-narrative. You could make the investigator look at two conflicting accounts instead of one clear case. If there was any question about the legitimacy of Nathan's original deed, the field notes argument became complicated. The timeline became contested, and the case that had been clean and straightforward became a tangle of competing claims that could take a year to resolve, which was what Whitmore needed. Not a win, just time. Time for the railway deal to move forward, for the land parcels to be assembled through other means, for Nathan to run out of money or patience or both. "Where's Nathan?" she said. "North pasture." "Get him, now." She was already at the desk pulling out the deed. "And Ernesto, does anyone know who Dawes is, where he came from?" "He's not from this county," Ernesto said. "Nobody I've talked to knows him." "Then he didn't witness anything," she said. "He was brought in." She was already turning pages. "Get Nathan." Ernesto went. She sat at the table with the deed, and she read through it with the focused, rapid attention she brought to every document she'd examined over these weeks, looking for what she needed. The witness signatures were at the bottom of the third page. 2 names, Gideon Pratt County Recorder, and below it, a second name. Thomas Aldrich. Not Dawes. Thomas Aldrich. She wrote the name down. She wrote it clearly at the top of a new page in the notebook. Then she looked at it. Nathan came in 15 minutes later with mud on his boots and urgency in his step. "Ernesto told me," he said. "The witness on your original deed," she said immediately. "His name is Thomas Aldrich, not Dawes. Do you know an Aldrich?" Nathan thought fast. "Tom Aldrich. He was a merchant in Ridgeback when I bought the property. He's been gone from here for..." He stopped. 8 years, maybe more. Moved to New Mexico. "Is he alive?" "I don't know." "Then we need to find out," she said. "Because if Tom Aldrich is alive and locatable, he is the actual witness, and Dawes is a fabrication. Briggs can verify signatures. Briggs will verify signatures, he's that kind of man. But the faster we can point him at the real witness, the less time Dawes' story has to do damage." Nathan looked at the deed, then at her. "Crane," he said. "Crane can reach out through legal channels, but Nathan..." She held his gaze. "We also need to go to Briggs today, before Cole or anyone from Whitmore's side gets to him with the Dawes story first." Nathan was already putting his hat on. They went to Crane first, 5 minutes enough for Margaret to lay out what she needed, and for Crane to understand it, and for Nathan to authorize the search for Thomas Aldrich through whatever professional contacts Crane had in New Mexico territory. Then they went to Briggs. He was at the county land office in the middle of examining the original filed documents when they arrived. His expression when he saw them told her he'd already heard about Dawes. "You know," she said. "A man named Dawes presented himself to me this morning," Briggs said. "He claims to have witnessed the original Caldwell deed signing and says the document was altered after the fact to add the southern pasture parcel." Nathan said, "The witnesses on that deed are Gideon Pratt and Thomas Aldrich. Nobody named Dawes was anywhere near that transaction." Briggs looked at him. "You're certain?" "I can name every person in the room the day I signed that deed," Nathan said. "Tom Aldrich was one of them. He was a merchant on this street. He's been in New Mexico for 8 years. Crane is trying to locate him now." Briggs picked up his pen and wrote something. "Pratt was there as well. Yes, he can confirm Aldrich's presence and Dawes' absence." Nathan paused. "Mr. Briggs, this is Whitmore's response to the freeze. They can't stop your investigation through the county, so they're trying to make it complicated enough that it takes 6 months instead of 6 weeks. Briggs looked at Nathan for a moment. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, "I've been doing this for 19 years. I'm aware of what this is." He set his pen down. "Dawes' account will be examined the same way your account is being examined. If he was not present at the signing, the signature analysis alone will likely establish that. If Mr. Aldrich can be located and speaks to the original transaction, Dawes' claim collapses." He looked at Margaret. "The strength of your case is the same today as it was 4 days ago. Don't let them convince you otherwise." Margaret held his gaze. "We won't," she said. Thomas Aldrich was found. Crane located him in 4 days through a legal colleague in Santa Fe, alive in reasonable health, and upon receiving Crane's letter explaining the situation, immediately furious in the way of a man who had a clean conscience about something and was hearing that his name had been used to dirty it. His letter arrived at Crane's office on a Friday, and Crane sent Pete riding to the ranch with it inside the hour. Margaret read it at the kitchen table with Nathan standing behind her reading over her shoulder. Aldrich remembered the signing clearly. He named Pratt. He named the date, the location, the particulars of the transaction. He stated with unambiguous directness that he had never met, spoken to, or heard of a man named Dawes. He was prepared to make a sworn statement notarized in Santa Fe and would send it within the week. Nathan made a sound that was not quite a word. Margaret set the letter flat on the table. She pressed her palm against it. All the weeks of it, the documents and the notebook, and the early mornings, and the long nights, and the gate and the fence, and Cole on the porch, and Briggs's careful questions, and Dawes's fabrication, and all of it. Every piece of it compressed in her chest into something she could not have named, but that felt for the first time like solid ground on the other side of something. Nathan put his hand over hers on the letter. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. His hand was warm and certain, and it was the most direct thing he'd offered her since she arrived, and she felt it all the way down in the place where she'd been keeping everything she wasn't ready to say yet. After a moment, he said very quietly, "It's going to hold." She looked down at their hands on the letter. "Yes?" she said. "It is." He didn't move his hand. She didn't move hers. The sun came through the kitchen window, the way it had since the first morning she'd stood here and looked at this cold, empty room, and decided she was going to make it something. The stove was warm. The marigolds were blooming in close rows outside the window, 6 inches apart, exactly right. "Nathan," she said. "Yeah. When this is over?" She stopped. "When this is over," he said quietly, "we're going to have a different conversation than the one we've been having." She looked up at him. His eyes were direct and certain, and completely without the careful distance she'd spent months learning to read around. "All right," she said. He nodded once. He went back to the north pasture. Margaret sat at the kitchen table with the letter under her palm, and the warm kitchen around her, and the particular quality of a moment she wanted to remember accurately, and she let herself feel it, fully, all of it, every part of it. She'd been keeping filed away for exactly as long as it took her to know it was real. Then she opened the notebook. She dated a new page. She wrote Thomas Aldrich located. Statement forthcoming. Case intact. She closed the notebook. She went to start supper. 3 days later, Dawes disappeared from Ridgeback as quietly as he'd arrived, and Everett Cole was not seen on Main Street after Thursday. And the word that moved through the county, in the way that words move through small communities from porch to porch, from wagon seat to wagon seat, from the feed store to the church steps, was that the Caldwell case was going to hold, and that what Whitmore had done to 3 families in this county was going to come into the light whether he wanted it to or not. Gideon Pratt heard it and said nothing, but his pale, sharp eyes were satisfied. Ruth Orville heard it and took her daughter Clara out to pick the last of the summer flowers, and stood in the field for a long time doing something that looked from a distance like a woman setting down a weight she'd carried too long. And on the Caldwell ranch, in the clean quiet of a September evening, with the mountains going golden at their edges and the marigolds holding their color in the fading light. Nathan Caldwell came in from the day's work and sat at the table where Margaret had supper waiting, and he looked at her across that table in the way he'd started to look at her openly without the careful management of everything he felt, and he said, "The north fence is done." She set a plate in front of him. "Good," she said. "All of it. Every post." She sat down across from him. "I know," she said. "I watched you work the last section this afternoon." He looked at her. "You were watching?" "I was in the garden," she said. "It's not far." He was quiet for a moment. "How long were you watching?" The left corner of her mouth moved. "Long enough," she said. Nathan Caldwell looked at his wife across the kitchen table in the last light of the September day, and whatever had been carefully managed and deliberately maintained and methodically kept in its proper place for 6 long years looked at him back from behind her warm brown eyes, and he knew with the same certainty he'd known the state of his fence line and his water rights and his cattle count and every other solid true thing in his life, that whatever conversation they'd been waiting to have was not far off. It was, he reckoned, about time. Samuel Briggs called the formal hearing for the 2nd Thursday of October, And the notice went out through the county the way official notices did, posted at the land office, the post office, the feed store. But the word traveled considerably faster than the paper, the way word always did in a county this size, when the thing being talked about was something people had been waiting to see happen. Nathan heard about the posting from Ernesto, who heard it from the man who delivered the grain, who had read it off the feed store wall that morning, while 3 other men stood beside him reading it too. By the time Nathan came in for the midday meal and told Margaret she had already heard it from Ruth Orville, who had ridden out specifically to tell her and was sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee, when Nathan came through the door. He stopped in the doorway and looked at Ruth. Ruth looked back at him with the composed steadiness of a woman who had come a long way since the day she sold her family's land for 60 cents on the dollar. "She beat you to it," Margaret said, not looking up from the stove. "Apparently," Nathan said. He came in and sat down. "The hearing is before a federal examiner," Ruth said. "Not Foster." "I know," Nathan said. "Briggs will present the findings. Both sides can bring evidence and testimony." She paused. "My husband is ready. Marlowe said he'd come if we needed him. The Hennessy's confirmed yesterday." Nathan looked at her for a moment. "Ruth, you know this hearing is about my water rights claim. Yours and the others, that's a separate matter." "I know what it's about," Ruth said. "But Briggs told Crane that if the pattern of conduct evidence comes in our accounts, the Hennessy's Marlowe's, it establishes that this wasn't a paperwork error. It establishes a method, a deliberate method." She held his gaze. "Your case wins bigger with us behind it. And our cases only move forward because yours opened the door." Nathan was quiet. Margaret set cups on the table and sat down. "She's right," Margaret said, "and we all know she's right." Nathan looked from Margaret to Ruth and back. "All right," he said. "Then we go in together." Ruth nodded. She finished her coffee and stood. At the door, she turned back. She looked at Margaret in the particular way that 2 women look at each other when they have been through something together that neither of them is going to describe accurately to anyone who wasn't there. "You built this," Ruth said. "I want you to know that I know that." Margaret held her gaze. "We all built it," she said. Ruth left. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Nathan sat with his hands around his cup and looked at the table, and Margaret looked at the side of his face, and the thing that had been growing in the space between them since that evening over the field notes letter pressed quietly against the inside of the moment. He felt her looking. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. He looked up. She looked back at him steadily, the way she looked at everything clear, direct, without flinching and without pretending. "Margaret," he said. "Nathan. We need to talk." "We talk constantly," she said. "We talked for 3 hours last night about the Briggs testimony structure." "That's not what I mean, and you know it." She did know it. She'd known it since the evening his hand covered hers on the Aldrich letter. She'd known it before that if she was being honest with herself, which she generally preferred to be. "After the hearing," she said. He looked at her. "After the hearing," he agreed. "But Margaret, I know," she said quietly. He nodded. She went back to the stove, and neither of them said what they both knew, which was that they had been in the after the hearing conversation for weeks already, had been living inside it without calling it by its name, and that what came next was not a beginning so much as an acknowledgement of something that had already, without permission or planning, become true. The hearing was in this Ridgeback courthouse, which was a building that had seen the Orville case dismissed and 3 other legitimate grievances swallowed by Harlan Foster's particular brand of purchased justice, and walking into it felt to Nathan like walking into a place that had a debt to pay. He came in with Margaret on his left and Crane on his right, and behind them, Ruth and James Orville and Eleanor and James Hennessy and old Gus Marlowe, who was 73 years old and had driven his wagon in from the Eastern Ridge at 4 in the morning to be here. And the courtroom, which was not large, was fuller than it had been for any county proceeding in recent memory. People had come, not because Briggs had required them, not because there was any official expectation of community attendance. They had come because in a county where people had watched their neighbors lose land and had felt the chill of understanding that it could just as easily be them. A hearing before a federal examiner with the power to set something right was not something you stayed home from. Nathan saw this as they came through the door and felt it land somewhere in his chest, with a weight he hadn't expected. He had spent 6 years on 14 miles of land, convincing himself that he had no connection to this town, no stake in its opinion of him, no need for anything it offered. He had done that very effectively, had maintained it through loneliness and work, and the careful management of every feeling that tried to suggest otherwise. He looked at the room full of people who had shown up. He looked at Margaret beside him. The wall had been down for a while now. He just hadn't announced it. Briggs sat at the examiner's table at the front, flanked by a clerk and a man Nathan didn't recognize, who Crane identified quietly as the federal court recorder. Harlan Foster was not present. That absence was the first thing Crane had noted when they came in a voice so carefully neutral, it said everything. On the other side of the room, Harrison Whitmore's legal representative was a man named Gerald Fitch, who had come down from Denver and had the look of someone accustomed to winning in rooms exactly like this one. He was organized and composed, and he nodded to Crane with the professional courtesy of a man who was preparing to take something apart methodically. Margaret looked at Fitch. Fitch looked at Margaret. She held his gaze long enough to be deliberate about it, and then she looked at Briggs, and she opened the notebook on the table in front of her to the first page, and she picked up her pen. Briggs called the hearing to order. The first hour was Briggs himself presenting the investigative findings. He was methodical and thorough, in the way she'd expected, walking through the field notes. Comparison, the survey marker discrepancy, the language shift in the water rights document. He presented Thomas Aldrich's sworn statement. He presented Gideon Pratt's professional testimony regarding the original recording standards. He laid it out in the same order she'd built the notebook sequence documentation cross-reference, because she had handed him the structure along with the evidence, and he had recognized it for what it was. Fitch objected twice on technical grounds. Briggs noted both objections and continued. Then Briggs called Margaret. She'd known he might. Crane had prepared her for it. But knowing and the actual moment of standing up in that room with every person in it looking at her were two different things, and she felt the familiar inventory of other people's eyes with the particular acuity of a woman who has been assessed by rooms full of people her whole life and learned to keep standing anyway. She went to the witness position. Briggs asked her to walk through her findings in her own words. She did. She spoke clearly and at a pace that let the recorder keep up, and she was specific about every reference and every date and every document. And she did not look at Fitch while she spoke, but she was aware of him, the way you're aware of weather peripherally, constantly reading it for what it was about to do. When she finished, Briggs thanked her. Fitch rose. He was smooth. She gave him that. He didn't attack her directly. He was too experienced for that. And the room's composition probably told him it would cost more than it gained. He went after the methodology instead. The basis for her assessment of the language shift. Her qualifications for evaluating survey documentation. Her familiarity with Colorado territorial land recording practices specifically. She answered every question, not defensively, not with the slightly elevated pitch of someone trying to prove they belong in the room. With the same even-grounded specific clarity she'd brought to every document and every conversation since the first morning she spread the water rights filing on the kitchen table and pointed Nathan to the line that didn't match. Fitch pushed on the survey language analysis. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said with the particular careful neutrality of a skilled lawyer going for something. "You've stated that the language shift in the water rights document indicates alteration rather than clerical transcription. On what basis do you make that determination given that you have no formal training in survey documentation?" "The same basis the documents themselves provide," she said. "The field notes use consistent terminology throughout stone markers, natural features, ridge references. The filed county document uses that same terminology in every section except the one describing the water rights boundary, where the language changes to iron post and fence line reference. A clerical transcription error would reproduce the original language incorrectly. What's in this document doesn't reproduce the original language at all. It introduces terminology that does not appear anywhere in the originating record." She paused. "You don't need formal training to identify when something has been replaced. You need to read both documents and compare what is there." The room was very quiet. Fitch looked at her for a moment. He sat down. Margaret went back to her seat. Nathan did not touch her hand or say anything because this was a federal proceeding and he understood how things needed to look. But she felt him solid and certain beside her, the way she'd felt him since that first morning when she stopped being alone in what she was doing. The twist came in the second hour, and it came from a direction no one in the room had prepared for. Briggs called a recess at noon. They were standing in the hall outside the courtroom. Nathan, Margaret, Crane, and the Orvells. When a man Margaret had never seen came quickly through the front door of the courthouse and went straight to Crane with the focused urgency of someone carrying something that needed to arrive. Crane listened. His expression did not change on the surface, but something shifted behind it, a sharpening, a rapid reorganization of whatever he'd been thinking about. He looked at Nathan. "Inside," he said. They went into a small room off the main hall. Crane closed the door. "The man who just came in is a clerk from the county land office," Crane said. "His name is Robert Ferris. He's been with the office for 11 years. A pause. "He wants to make a statement to Briggs." Nathan said, "What kind of statement?" "He says he was present when the water rights document was altered," Crane said. "He didn't alter it, but he saw who did. He was told it was a correction to a recording error, and he accepted that at the time. When Briggs's investigation began, and he understood what he'd actually witnessed, Crane stopped. "He's been sitting with it for 3 weeks. He came here this morning because he says he's done sitting with it." The room was silent. Margaret said, "Who did it?" Crane looked at her. "A man named Doyle. He was a deputy recorder until 8 months ago when he left the county suddenly. Ferris says Doyle did it on a Thursday afternoon when the main recorder was out sick. Ferris was in the file room. He saw Doyle at the cabinet with the Caldwell water rights file. He asked what he was doing. Doyle said he was correcting a transcription error on direction from the county recorder. Ferris accepted it." "Does Ferris know who directed Doyle?" Nathan asked. "He says Doyle had a meeting with Everett Cole 2 days before," Crane said. "He didn't know Cole's name at the time. He knows it now." Nathan stood very still. Margaret looked at the wall for a moment, running through the implications with the speed she'd developed over these weeks for exactly this kind of rapid reorganization. "This changes the case," she said. "Yes," Crane said. "Briggs has been working from the document evidence showing that the alteration happened. Ferris is a witness to the actual act of alteration and to Cole's prior contact. That's not a document fraud case anymore." She looked at Crane. "That's conspiracy." "Yes," Crane said again. "Which means it doesn't end with the water rights boundary being corrected," she said. "It means it follows back to Cole and through Cole to Whitmore." Nathan looked at her. She looked at him. 6 weeks of fence cuts and gate openings, and manufactured witnesses and campaigns in town against her character, and against his judgment, and against the solidity of what they'd built here. And all of it ran back to a Thursday afternoon, when a man named Doyle stood at a filing cabinet and changed 3 words in a public document, because someone with money told him to. "We need to get Ferris to Briggs before the afternoon session," Margaret said. "That's what I intend," Crane said. He was already at the door. The afternoon session was different from the morning. Briggs called Robert Ferris. Ferris was a slight, careful man in his early 40s, who held his hat in both hands the way people do when they're doing something that costs them, and they need something to hold on to. He sat in the witness position, and he spoke in the clear, precise voice of a man who has made a decision and is past the point of reconsidering it. He described the Thursday, the file cabinet, Doyle, what he'd been told, and why he'd accepted it. The meeting between Cole and Doyle he'd seen from the office window. He said he was sorry it had taken him this long. Briggs asked his questions without drama, with the same methodical clarity that characterized everything he did. Fitch rose for cross-examination. He questioned Ferris's certainty about the date about Cole's identity, about what he'd actually seen, versus what he'd inferred. Ferris answered without wavering. He'd had 3 weeks to sit with what he'd seen and what it meant. He was done being uncertain about it. When Fitch sat down, there was a quality in the room that wasn't quite silence and wasn't quite sound. The held breath of a collection of people who had just watched something shift. Briggs called a 15-minute recess. In the hall, Nathan stood beside Margaret and said nothing for a moment. He was looking at the floor at some middle distance in the space where thoughts live before they become words. Then he said, "Whitmore's going to try to distance himself from Cole." "Yes," she said. "Cole will be the wall." "Can they get past Cole to Whitmore?" "That depends on what else Briggs finds, and whether Cole decides the wall is worth standing behind when the alternative is standing alone in front of a federal conspiracy charge." She paused. "Men like Cole calculate. If the calculation changes, he might give Whitmore up." "He might," she said. "We'll see." Nathan looked at her. "You've thought about this for a while," he said. "Since the first time Cole stood on our porch and looked at me like I wasn't there," she said. Something moved through Nathan's expression, fierce and proud, and something else she was tired of not naming. "I owe you an apology," he said. She looked at him. "When you first arrived," he said, "the letter I sent, practical arrangements are preferred, as if—" He stopped. "As if what we are now was something I could have prevented if I'd just kept my distance well enough." She looked at him steadily. "Nathan," she said, "I'm apologizing, Margaret." "I know. I'm letting you." He waited. "I read that letter," she said. "I knew what it said. I came anyway." She held his gaze. "I came because I needed somewhere to go, yes. But I also came because a man who writes a letter that honest about what he can't offer is telling you something true about himself. And I thought a true man was worth the trip." Nathan looked at her for a long time in the hall of the Ridgeback Courthouse, with the sounds of the town outside and the voices of their neighbors through the courtroom door, and everything he'd been managing and maintaining and keeping in its proper place for 6 years looked back at her from his eyes without the careful distance in front of it. "You were right," he said, "about most things." "Most," she said. "The marigold spacing," he said. Clara's way was better. She almost laughed. It came out quieter than a laugh, something warmer. 6 inches, she said. 6 inches, he agreed. Briggs's decision came at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The federal examination found the water rights document filed at the county land office to be a fraudulent alteration of the original territorial record. The boundary description was declared invalid. The original field notes consistent with the deed survey were established as the controlling record. Nathan Caldwell's water rights to the South Pasture Creek tributary were confirmed in full and recorded at the territorial level outside the jurisdiction of the county land office. Briggs further referred the matter of document fraud and the involvement of Everett Cole to the federal prosecutor's office for investigation of conspiracy charges. The referral named Cole specifically. It noted without naming him that the investigation had identified a pattern of conduct across multiple property transactions in the county that warranted broader examination. Harlan Foster was not mentioned by name in the decision. He didn't need to be. The county knew what a federal referral in a case he'd been expected to preside over meant, and his particular silence on the matter of the Caldwell hearing communicated something that would take its own time to resolve. Whitmore's representative, Gerald Fitch, gathered his papers with the efficient composure of a very experienced attorney, absorbing a significant loss, and said nothing on his way out. Outside the courthouse, in the particular quality of a late October afternoon, where the air has gone cool and clear and the mountains to the west hold the last of the light. At their peaks, the people of Ridgeback County stood in something that was not quite a crowd and not quite a gathering, but was the natural result of many people being in the same place for the same reason and all of them feeling the same thing at once. Ruth Orville found Margaret first. She didn't say anything. She took Margaret's hand in both of hers and held it, and that was enough, and Margaret held it back. Old Gus Marlowe shook Nathan's hand with the grip of a man who'd driven since 4 a.m. and didn't regret a mile of it. James Hennessy said quietly to both of them, This was the right thing. Thank you for doing it the right way. Nathan nodded. He didn't say much. He wasn't a man who said much in moments like this, but the way he stood straight, present open in a way he had not been open in 6 years, said it. Aldous Crane found them as the crowd was thinning. Cole's attorney reached out to the federal prosecutor's office this afternoon, he said. Before 5 o'clock. Nathan looked at him. That fast? Cole's calculating, Crane said. He glanced at Margaret, as someone predicted he might. Who does he name? Margaret asked. That's still developing, Crane said carefully. But the direction of travel is what you'd expect. Margaret nodded. It would take its own time. Federal investigations always did. But the direction of travel was what mattered, and the direction was away from the Caldwell Ranch and toward the man who had sent the telegram that said, "Handle it now," and would now find out what it cost to send a message like that in a county with a record keeper who didn't look away. They drove home in the last of the light, Nathan and Margaret with the mountains going dark at their edges, and the road familiar under the wagon wheels, and the silence between them, the particular kind that has nothing left to be anxious in it. Somewhere around the 3rd mile, Margaret said, "You said after the hearing." "I did," Nathan said. She waited. He kept his eyes on the road for a moment. He was doing the thing he did when he was organizing himself to say something true, the stillness, the slight set of his jaw the moment before. Then he looked at her. "I spent 6 years making sure I couldn't feel anything," he said. "I was good at it. I thought it was the responsible thing not put anything at risk that I couldn't afford to lose again." He paused. "Then you stepped off that stagecoach and I drove you home, and you told me you didn't come here for sentiment, and I thought good. This is exactly what I asked for. This is manageable." She looked at him. "And then you planted the marigolds," he said, "and you sat with me the morning after I'd been in Clara's room. And you found the fraud in my own documents before I knew there was fraud to find. And you sent Cole off the porch and built the case while I was in Denver, and kept this place running and kept those men steady and—" He stopped, looked at the road, looked back at her. There was never a point where it stopped being manageable, Margaret, because it was never manageable. Not from the beginning. I just kept telling myself it was. She was quiet for a moment. "Nathan," she said, "I came here telling myself I was being practical. That I needed a home, and you needed help, and that was sufficient, and I was a grown woman who understood the terms of an arrangement." She paused. "I lasted about 11 days. He looked at her. 11 days, he said. "The morning in the kitchen, when you told me Clara would have been glad." She held his gaze. "I knew then. I just had very good reasons to pretend I didn't." The wagon moved on through the dusk. "What do we do about it?" he said. "I think," she said, "that we stop pretending." He reached across the wagon seat and took her hand. Not the way he'd covered her hand on the letter, careful brief bounded by the context of the moment. He took it the way a man takes something he intends to keep. Fully with his fingers through hers, her hand in his on the seat between them. She didn't move it. She looked at their hands for a moment. Then she looked at the road ahead, and at the mountains, and at the first stars coming through the dark above the peaks, and she felt the specific quality of a thing that has been earned, not given, not stumbled into, but built from the ground up with work and patience, and the willingness to stay when staying was hard. "Nathan," she said. "Yeah." "The south kitchen wall," she said. "I want to take it out, open the room up. It's too narrow for the way we actually use it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's a load-bearing wall." "I know. We'd need to put in a beam." "That's a week's work at least." "I know that too." Another pause. "I'll start pricing the lumber next time we're in town," he said. She tightened her hand in his. The wagon came around the long bend in the road, and the ranch came into view below them, the house with its lights on warm against the dark, the south bed where the marigolds were holding their last color of the season, the barn where Ernesto and Pete and Hatch were finishing the evening work, the north fence whole and solid from post to post all the way to the ridge. Nathan pulled the wagon to a stop. Not because anything was wrong. She understood that immediately the way he stopped was not the sharp alarm stop of trouble, but the deliberate stop of a man who wanted to look at something properly before he moved past it. They sat there on the wagon seat with their hands together and looked at the ranch in the evening. And Nathan Caldwell was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "For 6 years I kept that place running because I didn't know what else to do with myself. It was functional. It was mine. But I drove past it every single night, and I didn't feel anything when I saw it." He looked at Margaret. "I feel something now," he said. She looked at the house, at the lights, at the marigolds. "So do I," she said. He slapped the reins and they drove down. The months that followed were the kind of months that don't announce themselves as significant while they're happening. They're just days. Days that accumulate into something a person only fully understands when they look back at what they were before them. Nathan started the kitchen renovation in November. He and Ernesto took out the south wall on a cold morning and put in the beam and opened the room into something that breathed, and Margaret stood in the middle of it with sawdust on her dress and a look on her face that Nathan had put away in the part of himself where he kept things he wanted to remember accurately. Cole's cooperation with the federal prosecutor resulted in a formal indictment of Harrison Whitmore on conspiracy and fraud charges in January. The county received the news the way it received all significant news, quickly and thoroughly, and with the particular relief of a community that has been holding its breath and can finally let it out. Foster resigned his judgeship in February. He gave no public reason. He didn't need to. The Orville case was reopened. The Hennessy and Marlowe claims were reviewed under the new county recorder, a woman named Agnes Park, who had been the deputy recorder for 9 years and who walked into the office on her first morning as recorder and requested the full file on every land transaction in the county for the previous 3 years. Margaret went to see her. They talked for 2 hours. Agnes Park, it turned out, had a father who had been a merchant. She had learned numbers in his office. She had a way of looking at documents that involved reading everything twice and trusting nothing she hadn't cross-referenced. Margaret liked her immediately. On a Sunday in early spring, Nathan came in from the morning work and found Margaret at the kitchen table with the notebook open, not the case notebook which had been formally submitted to the federal court, and sat there now as part of the permanent record, but a new one. Blank pages, same cover. He looked at it. "Starting over," he said. "Keeping record," she said. "There's always something to keep record of." He poured himself coffee and sat across from her. The kitchen was wide and warm around them. The beam Ernesto had helped him set ran the width of the ceiling. The window was bigger than it had been. Margaret had asked for that too in November, a larger window on the south side so the kitchen got more afternoon light. It was a good kitchen now. It was a good house. Ruth Orville wants to plant a community garden on the north edge of her property, Margaret said without looking up from the notebook. She asked if I'd help organize it. "Will you?" "Yes." She looked up. "I said I'd ask if you could spare Ernesto a few Saturdays in April to help with the heavy work." Nathan looked at her. "That's what you're writing in the new notebook," he said. "That and a few other things." "What other things?" She turned the notebook toward him. The first page had a list. Not accounts, not evidence, not dates and incidents. A different kind of record. South kitchen wall removed November. Room is right now. Nathan's laugh. "I have now heard it 4 times. It sounds like something that was always supposed to be there. Marigolds order more seeds in March. Plant closer than the catalog says. Pete apologized to me properly. He is going to be all right. Gideon Pratt came to supper Thursday. He ate 2 plates and told a story about the founding of the county that had Nathan laughing for the 3rd time. I counted. Ruth Orville's daughter Clara has her mother's eyes and her own stubbornness. She will be formidable. This is home." Nathan read it slowly. When he looked up, everything he'd spent 6 years managing was fully and completely gone from his face. Not covered, not controlled, just gone, replaced by the particular expression of a man who has finally put down something very heavy and found that his hands are free. He reached across the kitchen table, his kitchen table, their kitchen table, in their kitchen, in their house on their land, solid and legal, and corrected in the record and belonging to them without qualification. And he put his hand over hers on the open notebook. "Margaret Ellis Caldwell," he said. She looked at him. "I ordered a practical arrangement," he said. "I asked for someone to help me run a ranch. I told you not to expect anything from me that resembled a real marriage." He paused. "I was wrong about all of it. About what I was capable of. About what this could be. About you." His hand tightened over hers. "I was wrong, and I am the most grateful man in Colorado Territory for being that wrong." She looked at him across the table, in the wide, warm, well-lit kitchen, on the morning of an ordinary day that was also like all the days since November, not ordinary at all. "I know," she said. "That's all you're going to give me." The left corner of her mouth moved. "I came 1,400 miles on a train and a stagecoach to a man who warned me not to expect kindness," she said. "I found the fraud in his land records, built the case that saved his ranch, held his property together while he was in Denver, and sat with him in his kitchen the morning after he cried in his dead wife's room without making him feel ashamed of it." She looked at him steadily. "I think I've given you considerable, Nathan Caldwell." He looked at her. "You have," he said quietly. "You have given me everything." She turned her hand under his so that her fingers were through his, the same way they'd been on the wagon seat in the October dark. "Then we're even," she said. Outside, the Colorado spring was doing what it did, uncertain and insistent at once, snow still on the peaks and green already pushing up through the south garden bed where the new marigold seeds were waiting under the soil at 6 inches, exactly the way they'd always been planted on this land, by hands that loved it. Nathan Caldwell had prepared himself for a cold marriage and a practical arrangement and a life managed at careful distance from everything that could hurt him. What he got was Margaret. And Margaret Ellis had come west looking for a place to belong, prepared to earn her keep and ask for nothing beyond the practical terms she'd agreed to. What she found was home. Not because the land was beautiful, or the house was grand, or the circumstances were anything other than difficult and contested and hard-won every single step of the way, but because the man across the table had turned out to be true, and because true men in her experience were worth every mile of the journey it took to find one. The ranch that had been silent for 6 years was silent no longer, and the woman who had spent 30 years being told she was too much, too big, too capable, too direct, too unwilling to make herself smaller for the comfort of people who couldn't handle her full size, had found the one place on earth where every single thing she was turned out to be exactly enough. That was not luck. That was not accident. That was two people who chose every single day to be brave enough to let the real thing in, and that choice made again and again in kitchens and courtrooms and courthouse halls and wagon seats in the October dark was the whole of it. That was the story. That was the truth of it. And it held.